So, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. We do have a online audience as well, so thank you for watching us. My name's Tiffany Basciano, and I'm the Associate Director of the International Law and Organizations program here at SAIS. And I just want to welcome you to today's conference on Nepal and good governance. So, about 4.5 months ago, 13 SAIS students and myself traveled to Nepal to look into issues of constitutionalism, transitional justice, statelessness, and the corresponding gender equality issues. In return, we learned so much more than that. We learned about economic development and bilateral relations with its very large neighbors. We had an opportunity to appreciate the diversity and beauty that is Nepal, from the Himalayas to the temples to the momo that we will have for lunch here as well. And I think we would be remiss to not profusely thank Ambassador Karki, who's the Nepali ambassador to the United States, who helped us so much with our visit and arranged a meeting with President Bandari. It's not often that we get to meet presidents of countries, so it was a very special experience for us. And I think that we could not have asked for a more interesting time to visit Nepal. We were there around the time of the 12th anniversary of the peace deal that ended the Maoist conflict. Transitional justice mechanisms were ongoing and have recently been renewed for another year. And probably most obvious and important is the new Constitution of 2015. And so we had a chance to understand how federalism was going to be implemented, and that area has a lot of interest. So Nepal is a young democracy at a pivotal moment in time, and we look forward to watching it flourish and watching federalism at work. Federalism is we don't quite have it right in the US. It takes a lot of work to figure out the separation of powers. So it's a very interesting time to observe Nepal. So with that, I want to just give a bit of information about today's conference and the structure. It's on the record. We're being video recorded and live tweeted potentially. And so this morning, we're going to have 3 panels. They're about 45 minutes each. There'll be short breaks in between for coffee and bathroom. And each panel will have an opportunity for Q&A. If you have a question, just make sure that you talk into a microphone. We'll have a roving mic, hopefully. So make sure you're talking to a microphone so you get picked up on the audio and the video. And after the 3 panels this morning, we'll have lunch, we'll have momo, and after lunch, we'll have one more panel. So with that, please allow me to welcome our first panel on bilateral relations, and turn it over to Spencer Gross, who will moderate. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Friday morning. As Tiffany said, my name is Spencer Gross. I'm a student here at SAIS, and I'll be moderating this morning's panel. So first, I just want to introduce our panelists. First, we have, Palak, I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name before I introduced you.
Sharma.
Sharma, okay. So we have Palak Sharma. She is a second-year MA candidate with a concentration in environment, and energy. I'm reading it correctly here. And a minor in South Asia Studies. Before SAIS, she researched Buddhist economics and presented her writings at the Center of Bhutan Studies Conference with the Growth National Happiness Center and TEDx. I will also mangle this pronunciation, Bilwara. After a bachelor's degree, she interned at one of the Gateway Houses, one of India's foremost think tanks, and then went on to establish a nonprofit with her family that focuses on the education of underprivileged children. Since her time at SAIS, she has interned at the World Resources Institute, which has increased her interest in GIS and studying hydropolitics. On her right, we have Anna Berger, who is a second-year student concentrating in international economics and international law. She graduated from Kenyon College in 2015, where she majored in international studies and modern languages and literatures, studying German and Spanish, and minored in anthropology. Before matriculating at SAIS, she served with the Episcopal Services Corps in Columbus, Ohio, working at a community refuge and International Immigration Services, a refugee resettlement agency. Following her first year at SAIS, Anna interned at the Russian International Affairs Council in Moscow, and at RIAC, she worked the Eurasian Development Program, conducting trade data research, publishing an article on the RIAC website about the effects of shifting U.S. trade policy on BRIC countries, and contributing to a project on global conceptions of sovereignty. Her academic interests include trade law and policy migration studies, as well as post-conflict transitions, which is especially relevant for today's panel. We have Catherine Tyson on my left, who is a second-year graduate student here, concentrating in international economics and international law, and capacity building and stakeholder engagement at the Fair Labor Association and Conflict and Humanitarian Crises Initiative, and also a research assistant at the Foreign Policy Institute. Between her first and second year, she interned at Just Capital, where she assessed the corporate social responsibility, supply chain sustainability, and philanthropic practices of publicly traded U.S. companies for an annual ranking released with Forbes. And before her matriculation at SAIS, she worked for 3 years as a senior business consultant and project manager, and attained her BA magna cum laude in anthropology and international studies from Northwestern University. And while at Northwestern, she worked with the Center for Forced Migration Studies and Heartland Alliance, a refugee resettlement agency, and completed her senior honors thesis on cultural integration of Iraqi and Bhutanese refugees during resettlement. Her areas of interest include forced displacement, economic impacts of migration, and the nexus of public and private sector advancement and human rights. And finally, we have on her left, John Poor. John, did I pronounce your last name correctly?
You got it.
I'm glad. Who is also a second-year international law and economics student here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and he mostly focuses on the effects of trade on development. When he is not studying, he's working at as a trade policy analyst for a major agricultural organization here in D.C. Before coming to SAIS, he spent 5 years in business development, 2 years in the nonprofit sector, and he has managed business teams in the pharmaceutical sector, driven account development and analytics, tutored at-risk youth in inner-city settings, taught financial literacy classes to adults. And he also has experience using statistical software, managing intercultural dialogue, and managing research teams. So a wide variety of experts here on our panel today. And with that, we will start with Pollock.
Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. Speaking of our trip to Nepal, we learned many things, but my presentation and my paper is primarily focused on the trade between India and Nepal relations and how that trade has been reflective of diplomatic ties between these two countries. So let's get started. Just a brief history of Nepal, that in this region of South Asia, Nepal has often been segregated or identified as a buffer state between the two giants of India and China, due to which it was not colonized by the British, considering that it could serve as that important political role to keep two powers away from each other, but at the same time maintaining its own power. But this allowed it to continue its monarchy and not establish institutions of democracy or that were being established by the British in the rest of South Asia at that time. So that created a lot of problems or differences between how Nepal grew as a country as compared to how India or other South Asian countries grew, and that's something we see is being fixed with every constitution they've had, and those are the issues that we see prop up even with trade. So a brief timeline of this is that in 2015, 20th September was when the new constitution of Nepal was promulgated. And on the 23rd of September, just 2 days after that, an embargo was imposed by India, which was a trade embargo for the most crucial resources that came to Nepal from India would then not being able to reach there. So things like petrol were the main issues, because transport or even emergency vehicles such as ambulances, every level of society faced the issues that were coming from this trade embargo, and it seriously put a strain on the relations with India and Nepal. However, after the embargo was lifted, and after that, when Sushma Swaraj, the foreign minister of India at that time, on the 22nd of February 2016, when she went to try to ameliorate relations, her idea was that everything is improving and on its way to improve because Nepal had two amendments of the constitution to take care of the Madhesi population, which was apparently not well represented in the previous constitution. Now, what these issues have done is visible in this chart, which is the export chart of Nepal to India. Now, you see that around the time of 2015 or late 2014, trade had significantly bolstered, and you can see the rising period since 2012. The idea of moving from acting east to looking east was proposed by the Indian government to have larger number of trade opportunities with the eastern neighbors. But you can see this enormous dip in late 2015, which is when the embargo was placed. So these exports have reflected on the diplomatic ties. And we can see that further with the Nepali exports to India as opposed to the Nepali exports to China. So if you see from 2007 to 8 financially, and from the financial year 2016 to 17, the exports to India rose only 8% overall because there have been a lot of other vicissitudes in the middle that have made the relations very difficult. However, as opposed to China, where the exports have risen 35% in the same time frame. Now, the exports rising to China 35% is not enormous, but at the same time, if you see, considering that these two nations, what role they've played for Nepal, that definitely shows a failure for India's diplomatic relations. So, to move on, how trade has been important for Nepal and China in this sphere, we can see that Nepal's GDP is equivalent to the GDP of Mali and Benin, and it also is a landlocked country. So it identifies that not only there is great potential for development, but at the same time, there aren't the same resources maybe another developing and underdeveloped country has. So the relations or the sensitivity with which it has to handle India and Nepal is extremely high. And we see that, as we see the trade increasing with China, that there is more relations now than there were before, but India will yet be a default ally. And I talk about this in my paper because the closest city, well-inhabited city from Kathmandu to, Chinese inhabited city from Kathmandu is 200 kilometers away, which is 125 miles away. And this represents that if you see the map, there's China and there's India, but practically, and many people who we spoke to in our trip to Nepal as well said that Nepal is India-locked because the region that is the Chinese border is uninhabited or largely mountainous. So it's not easy for trade. It's not easy for relations. It's not easy or it's not what you would expect, even a cultural sharing of history. None of that is really there. And that is entirely present with the relations between India and Nepal because there's history with culture and economies. And there's the South Asian Free Trade Agreement, SAFTA, that India and Nepal share. And we can see that even though SAFTA is there, the trade relations have not been as what you would expect. So looking at that, how do we see that we can make a change or how India could help these relations can come down to three main ideas: energy, trade, and diplomacy. The first idea being energy is because, as mentioned, Nepal has great potential for growth, especially with energy poverty being an issue that Nepal identifies, and so does India identify that along with these relations. And that's why they started trading energy in 1971. But as we know, Nepal is home to the Himalayan ranges, and even with the border alongside India is very mountainous terrain. So these issues have been great roadblocks to have transmission lines or grids to allow energy trade to a very, very large degree as what you'd expect considering the border that's shared. And so a joint energy body is something that is identified to be the most crucial committee that could come together and communicate these ideas to the governments, government of environment and government of energy in India and as well as Nepal, and an energy banking deal. Now, an energy banking deal has been agreed upon by the Power Exchange Committee a few years back. However, ideas or projects such as the One Belt, One Road initiative are things that push Nepal more towards China. And the focus of India keeping close relations with Nepal would again come with a joint energy body, because it would continue to communicate such issues to the governments which are not being communicated at the moment. Further diplomatic issues come along with the idea that Nepal has many projects with China, such as the Budhi Gandaki, which would bolster Nepal greatly, but then they would sell or would hope to sell that energy to India, which India then refuses to buy. If that would be that would ever happen, if this kind of project happens, we would not buy energy that is supported and funded by the Chinese. So these kinds of diplomatic blunders or errors are what continue to not only stop development in Nepal, but also interrupt their ties. Second one is trade. Now, we spoke about exports from Nepal to India, so we can see exports from India to Nepal. That is, the Indian exports to Nepal in 2007 were 1.8% of the total exports, and it fell in 2017 to 0.87%, which is quite a staggering number in the first place. That's only 1.8%, and then it fell even a percent further. So the relations have only been going downwards, and the idea from going looking east to acting east have not necessarily translated to the level that we'd hoped. So going back, there's been a treaty of peace and friendship in 1950 between India and Nepal, where Article 7 should definitely now, going forward, be the main idea or the main key highlighted point, that is the participation in trade and commerce, because that's definitely place and potential where both these countries can continue better relations. Where the recommendation would be to have a government committee alongside the Joint Energy Body Committee to collect data and issue redressals, because there has been no data collection in considering how the energy has expanded or how many projects have been proposed and then either cancelled or how far they've been. These kinds of historical understanding of how far things have come have been absent. And the last one would be diplomacy. So energy and trade both would definitely tie into diplomacy, but the idea is that there has been an open border policy with India and Nepal, and everybody that we spoke to in Nepal, considering the Honorable Prime Minister or other delegations or think tanks, they've all understood the close relations between India and Nepal, but the cross-border trade has been more with people rather than things that could help their economy. So the transit trade treaty with China definitely highlights that as well, because Nepal was entirely reliant on India for ports, but the transit trade treaty gave Nepal access to Chinese ports, ending the monopoly on Indian ports for Nepal. This represented a moment that India realized that there's been a mistake, which is why Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj, Prime Minister Narendra Modi then visited Nepal to reassure the people that we're yet your elder brother, not big brother, and such kinds of interests. And alongside, Nepal also signed 8 infrastructure projects with China. And these are things that keep happening and keep getting proposed. And how far they'll come is something we'll see with time. But what India can do now is to lower tariffs for construction projects and rehabilitation projects, which would be something that Nepal is really looking towards China. And not that there isn't enough reason for them to have Chinese construction, but there would be a much lower economic burden on them, considering the ease with which India can trade that. And the other thing would be knowledge exchange. There have been, of course, there are students and there are laborers on both sides that go back and forth. But the issues with knowledge exchange is recording that knowledge exchange, understanding how that's come about, understanding how we can learn from them. So the aim is significantly to strengthen political ties, but as a means of using energy, trade, and diplomacy to assure better relations with India and Nepal, considering that not only is Nepal a primarily landlocked and significantly India-locked country, but also that this could benefit India and Nepal, because a stable Nepal is in Indian interests, and so is it better for Nepal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Palak. So our next panelist is Anna Berger.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out this morning, and thank you, Palak, for that fantastic presentation. So following up on Palak's presentation, I'm going to shift a little bit to look at the other side of the equation and talk about the Nepali-Chinese relationship, particularly connected to trade. So as Palak mentioned, Nepal's a small landlocked country between India and China. Therefore, it has no access to seaports of its own, so it's entirely reliant on, historically it's been entirely reliant on India for access to seaports and for other trading routes. And again, as Palak mentioned, India and Nepal have historically had a very close relationship because of the many similarities between them culturally and socially. But she noted that in 2015, there was a trade embargo imposed by India on Nepal. And this was extremely significant because of the April 2015 earthquake in Nepal. This was something that came up in almost all of the meetings that we had in Nepal. As Palak mentioned, this embargo was focused on petrol. However, there were many other items that had their flow over the border impeded by this embargo, including critical humanitarian items such as medicine and food. And in the wake of the April 2015 earthquake, when Nepal was still struggling, several months later in September, the fact that they had this trade embargo imposed on them, and they suddenly had a limitation on the humanitarian items that were able to come into the country, was very difficult and devastating. And it was kind of a pivotal moment. It was a watershed moment that a lot of the people with whom we had meetings in Nepal identified as a shift in the mindset of the Nepali government in the way that it approached its relations with both India and China. So it had been happening for a while that the Nepali government had recognized that it needed to diversify a bit in terms of its relations. Again, it historically had depended on India for trade. The government had recognized that there needed to be a shift in that. However, this embargo really hit that home for them. And so subsequently, in September 2018, just this past year, as Palak mentioned, Nepal and China finalized their transit transport agreement, which they had originally signed in March 2016, so just 6 months after that trade embargo had been imposed by India. And this treaty allows Nepal to use 4 Chinese seaports and 3 Chinese dry ports. So now they have this opportunity to utilize all of these Chinese ports. And so the question that remains now is, what does this mean for Nepal in terms of development? Are these ports going to actually represent a significant shift in the way Nepal approaches trade? Are they going to utilize these ports? And experts kind of differ on how they think that these ports are going to affect Nepali development, as well as Nepali-India and Nepali-China relations. So Nepal has a historically astronomical trade deficit. For 2017 to 2018, this was a $10.55 billion trade deficit. And so a lot of people are hoping that now, with the ability to access Indian ports and Chinese ports, there will be increased trade in Nepal internationally, and this will help to assuage the trade deficit. But other experts are cautioning this optimistic outlook with regards to how much these ports are actually going to change things for Nepal. So even though Nepal now has access to these Chinese ports, it has to be noted that the Indian seaports are much closer to Kathmandu, which is the center of economic activity in Nepal, than are Chinese ports. The closest Indian port is 800 miles or 800 kilometers away from Kathmandu, while the closest Chinese port is 2,600 kilometers away from Kathmandu. So that presents a question of economically, is it going to be economically feasible for Nepali businesses to utilize these ports, particularly given the fact that, especially in the wake of the earthquake, infrastructure in Nepal is very limited in terms of roads. So there's no all-weather road to China through Nepal. So how feasible will transport of these items to these Chinese ports actually be? Other experts have noted that despite the fact that these Chinese ports are farther, it may actually be an economically better choice to try to go to the ports in China because of fees that are charged on items at Indian ports. So when firms bring their items to Indian ports from Nepal, oftentimes they have to submit documentation to port authorities there, and they have to have a hold on their items. And so having these items sit at the port for 2 weeks or more really represents a big cost to these firms. So will that cost balance out in terms of having the larger travel distance to China? And this also may be affected by China's One Belt, One Road project. There's been a lot of work with China in terms of Nepal. They've created several of their parts of their One Belt, One Road project in Nepal. For instance, they're creating a Nepal-China cross-border railway, as well as the Nepal-China cross-border transmission line, which are both part of the One Belt, One Road project. They're parts of a larger trans-Himalayan multi-dimensional connectivity network. And Nepal and China signed a memorandum of understanding on the One Belt, One Road project in May 2017. So it may end up being that the matter of making it to Chinese ports becomes no issue because of the increased infrastructure and connectivity between Nepal and China. And further, Nepal has requested that China conduct further feasibility studies on further railways connecting cities from the center of Nepal to the Nepali-China border. There's also been discussions of plans for several new airports, international airports in Nepal, which would also increase the ability of items to move across the border. So this issue is also further complicated in terms of development by the internal government in Nepal. So even if all of these infrastructure projects take place and there's able to be increased GDP in Nepal because of this increased trade, there's also limitations imposed simply by kind of the domestic situation in Nepal in terms of government. So something that we heard in a couple of meetings was the way that the Nepali government, the federal government, spends its budget. So we had a couple meetings where those that we met with noted the fact that many years the Nepali government doesn't spend all of its federal budget, or it does spend all of it, but it only spends a large portion of it in the last month of the fiscal year. It'll get to the point where it realizes there's a month left in the fiscal year and they have 25% of the federal budget remaining, and they'll go out and spend the rest of this budget on, for instance, road improvements in Kathmandu, and then a month later the roads are filled with potholes again because they've just thrown all this money at kind of trying to artificially kind of make things better, and they're not actually able to put the money into the infrastructure projects that are going to be long-term and can actually affect Nepali development in the long-term stage. So even if there is this increased connectivity between Nepal and China, and Nepali firms are able to move items more easily, both to China, because of course China is a very large market. So with all this connectivity, not only will items be able to be transported to Chinese ports and exported globally, but also there'll be more access for Nepali products within China, which of course will increase the Nepali GDP. But if the Nepali government internally is not able to improve its own ability to put money into long-term infrastructure projects, this is not necessarily going to have the large magnitude of effect that people are hoping that these opening of these ports will have. So kind of remains to be seen what's going to happen with this, but it's going to be a really interesting development to watch over the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Catherine?
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for being here this morning, and I just want to thank previous panelists for excellent presentations. As had been mentioned before, as an undergrad, I had completed a thesis really exploring the integration of a lot of Bhutanese refugees in Chicago during resettlement. And what I was really excited about the opportunity to go to Nepal was to really understand on a deeper level, the country that a lot of these Bhutanese refugees had come from, as Nepal has been the primary destination for Bhutanese refugees that fled or were expelled from their country in the wake of a lot of changes in laws within Bhutan. Although official counts of refugees within Nepal have declined in recent years, there are still approximately 22,248 persons of concerns that are officially registered with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR. And so I was really eager to understand what the opportunities were for potential long-term solutions to the protracted crises of a lot of these different refugees remaining within Nepal since, in many cases, since the 1990s. And understand what really lay at the root of some barriers to that. And ultimately, as I'll go through, determined through a lot of the conversations that we had with government and civil society actors that a lot of the lack of long-term solutions as it currently stands is really attributable to the state and populace's perception of geopolitical and economic challenges facing the country. And because this has resulted in few accesses to official remedy, that the treatment of individual refugee groups within the country is left largely to the attitude of government leadership and external state actors. So going back to the fact that there are still at least approximately 22,000 officially registered refugees within the country. However, due to the way that official registration of refugees within the country has changed throughout the 1990s and early millennium, the true number of refugees within the country is estimated to be much higher. The main groups of refugees still remaining within Nepal are Bhutanese refugees, and many of them were resettled in the past decades, but those who remain in Nepal largely were those who refused to be resettled to a third country, which is one of the durable solutions recognized by UNHCR, or they were somehow deemed ineligible for resettlement. Another larger group of refugees within the country are Tibetans, and in particular, although there are only 20,000 registered Tibetan refugees, Nepal has actually stopped registering Tibetan refugees as of 1989. So it's not really known how many Tibetan refugees there are within the country, and particularly as they've remained and had children, what the true population size really is, even though there are estimates out there. And then the final recognized group of refugees within the country is urban refugees, those who largely reside in Kathmandu, mostly comprising of Pakistanis and some Somalis. Just as a legal level setting, Nepal is not a signatory to the 1951 UNHCR Convention relating to the status of refugees, or its 1967 protocol that expanded the definition of refugees to be more expansive, which is significant in that there's not an international framework that they're aspiring to, and there isn't currently a legal domestic framework that provides official legal status to refugees. And due to that, most of these refugees are stateless, and that was the idea of statelessness was a big theme of our trip to Nepal and really learning about that. And ultimately, the statelessness of most refugees within Nepal is due to the current citizenship law. As further panels will delve into a little more deeply. The main law that determines citizenship within Nepal is the Nepal Citizenship Act of 2006. It confers citizenship mainly to children born to Nepali citizen parents, to persons who have contributed specially to the development of certain arts or economic fields, and satisfy several additional criteria, as well as to women who marry a Nepali citizen. And although there are a couple of paths in this law that have provided ways for refugees within the country prior to April 1990 to theoretically have access to an application mechanism for citizenship, they actually are required to have a certificate of land or home ownership in order to even apply. So this isn't accessible to the vast majority of refugees. And so delving into a little bit more of why this citizenship law has the restrictions that it does, and particularly when looking within the refugee context, really found that the relationship with Nepal's powerful neighbors, as discussed previously, India and China, the perception of the geopolitical threat posed by these neighbors contributed to a lot of the restrictions that are placed on the current citizenship law, and in some areas of the country have even complicated its implementation in the current form. Both China and India, if you can't tell already, did feature strongly in our discussions with government and civil society leaders, and often the discussions of economic and military might of China and India were seamlessly discussed as potential threats to Nepali sovereignty, and a justification for the current law's restrictions. For example, the inability of Nepali women to transfer citizenship to foreign spouses, in many cases was discussed in tandem with the long shared border with India along Province 2, and the history of intermarriage between Nepali women and Indian men. And particularly within Province 2, which is the border region with India, a couple of organizations that we spoke to mentioned that there is this predominant narrative within the province that India poses a great threat to cultural erosion of Nepali identity. And that has actually even complicated the implementation of the law in its current form, as local authorities have sometimes just refused to issue citizenship documents. And that is something that the federal government has recognized and is actively working to remediate. Beyond this citizenship law, another significant barrier to the institution of any kind of path to citizenship for refugees is particularly the precarious state of Nepal's domestic labor market currently. We learned that larger businesses within Nepal largely struggle to function due to a history of corruption with past administrations, a lack of clarity in government bureaucracy and regulation, some of the challenges that Anna mentioned to infrastructure as a result of the earthquake, as well as a deficit of skilled labor within the country. And unfortunately, this has led to a situation where there are really few opportunities for formal employment for the unskilled labor within the country. And informal economy participation is really expanding. As approximately 89% of the refugees within Nepal are also low-skilled, refugees have largely been perceived by the populace as a significant economic threat to themselves. And actually, the Nepal's National Unit for the Coordination of Refugees Affairs actually, in previous years, asked UNHCR not to recognize any additional urban refugees so that they would not be perceived as a haven for illegal immigration. And arguably, this move has left many foreign nationals that would be in need of protection according to traditional refugee definitions, instead at risk of deportation and heavy fines for illegal visa overstay, as they're perceived more as an economic threat rather than people in need of humanitarian protection. And ultimately, these factors that have contributed to restrictions on path to legal remedy have really left the treatment of refugees within Nepal to the discretion of current government leadership. And this is particularly notable in the divergent treatment of Bhutanese and Tibetan refugees within the country. On one hand, Bhutanese refugees have largely been left as they are and unmolested by law enforcement, as the Prime Minister feels a sense of cultural kinship between Bhutanese refugees and Nepali citizens. Conversely, Tibetan refugees have increasingly been targeted by law enforcement in the years since the blockade was instituted by India, and the Nepali government has established a closer economic relationship with China, as Anna went over. And ultimately, it is suspected that this closer economic relationship with China has really played a part in the way that Tibetan refugees have been treated by Nepali authorities, and reportedly even law enforcement actively suppressed the celebration of World Peace Day, a significant holiday for Tibetans, at the direction of Chinese authorities, either directly or indirectly. And ultimately, moving forward, due to the conflation of these factors, it doesn't seem like there are long-term solutions for Nepal's refugee communities in the near or short term, particularly not paths to legal status within the country. In the longer term, a number of things need to happen before there can realistically be access to legal remedy. Successful standardization of legal implementation in Nepal, an improvement in Nepal's domestic economy, a shift in Nepal's relationship with India and China that lessens the perception of geopolitical threat, and as well as Nepal's approval of the UNHCR conventions that would standardize its approach to these issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. And last but not least, we have John.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, fellow panelists, for your excellent presentations. So what I want to speak about is specifically the paradoxical position of Nepal, and that it has some of the worst growth in South Asia. As far as it's lagging behind Afghanistan, it's lagging behind Pakistan. It is doing terribly when it comes to pushing a GDP forward. That said, it's the #1 within the region for human capital development, or human development in general. And that's not something that we typically see in the world. That's a rare condition. So what I want to do is ask, how is this the case? Is it sustainable? And what are the options for moving forward within Nepal and maintaining a human development position? So in the first place, I want to address the economy and how it is that it is so anemic and lagging behind the rest of the area. And as my fellow panelists have said, it's a landlocked country. It's sandwiched between two of the world's fastest growing and somewhat adversarial nations, that being China and India. It's mountainous, and though it demonstrates resource potential in hydropower and timber, it does not have the transportation networks, it doesn't have the human capital, no way to really capitalize on that at the moment. It's facing a tremendous number of issues across a bunch of different platforms. It's a post-conflict nation. It's got some of the highest risk in the world for natural disasters. In fact, it was 2015 that there was an earthquake that killed 9,000 people, it injured 22,000 people, and it damaged the infrastructure of Nepal at an equivalent value of 50% of the national GDP. In addition to this, it's got a long history of authoritarian and extractive regimes that have left a legacy of patronage and a lot of nepocratic action. And they're trying to implement a new constitution at the moment. So all of this has had major knock-on effects, and it's made it so that Nepal is one of the worst in the area for getting any kind of FDI, and foreign direct investment is absolutely key for a developing nation to continue economic growth. But it just seems so uncertain that Nepal is actually receiving about 1/3 of the foreign direct investment that Afghanistan is, and Afghanistan is the 3rd worst in the region for foreign direct investment. As far as their export portfolio is concerned, they're exporting the equivalent of about 9% of their GDP. For most economies in the world that are able to escape the low-income trap, they have to be sitting more around 20% of their portfolio. Their imports are actually 17 times higher than what their exports are. So they've got somewhat of a crippling balance of trade. And rather than seeing improvements on this, it was actually between 2009 and 2013 that they saw a 46.5% decrease in their competitiveness on the trade market. And they're actually seeing about 3% decrease in their specialization within trade. So these are all factors you would normally want to look for growth in a country. So this brings us to the mysterious question of how it is that they have such amazing human development conditions. And the answer is not some complex mystery. They have about twice what the next person in line does for remittances in the world. They are one of the #1 receivers for remittances. It's 1 out of 2 families are actually receiving those remittances. And it's the equivalent of about 30% of their GDP. So that brings us to the question of whether these remittances are sustainable. And simply put, they're not. Remittances have very limited benefits and for a short amount of time. They've worked great up to this point to get Nepal where it is. They're really good at reducing pressure within labor markets where there's not enough jobs to be offered to all of the young workers. It's really good at dealing with inequality because it doesn't matter what your income is. If you can get that plane ticket, you can go work and you can bring money back for your family. It's really well at going under the radar, so it's hard for government officials that take too much of your money, et cetera, et cetera. And it's good at providing very basic goods so that people can get on the road to success, nutrition, et cetera. But it comes with major drawbacks, and these drawbacks are cumulative. Over time, remittances become worse and worse for a country who's trying to escape low-income status and move into the middle-income status. Specifically, it's constantly depleting your human capital. And so when you have these workers that are going abroad, each time they go abroad, maybe 1 or 2 less is going to come back. In addition, if they can make more money elsewhere, you're going to be losing a lot of your skilled labor that would stay at home and work and be entrepreneurs, be innovative, et cetera. They're going abroad, they're making the money, and they're sending it home. So you've got a major issue as far as that's concerned. It causes real exchange rate issues. So it'll appreciate your exchange rate, and what is that going to do? That's going to make it so anyone that does want to export from Nepal is now having to sell their goods at a significantly higher price in the international market. So the neighbors are actually going to end up being more competitive. They're not going to be able to sell into those markets on any kind of price competition with labor or anything along those lines. It's causing a bolstered reliance on foreign imports. So if everybody has already established supply chains that are going to be pulling in any kind of tableware, if it's pulling in a lot of your agricultural imports, if it's pulling all of these things in, then anyone within your country that enters that market is going to have to get over that first mover advantage that's already been given to the other countries, and they're going to have to get over those supply chains. So they're going to have to come in at a lower price point. It creates conditions of rentier state characteristics. So if your politicians aren't directly receiving benefit from you in way of taxation or anything along these lines, they're going to be less responsive to you. If you're having to provide everything to do with your local roads and healthcare and everything else, if you're getting this a lot from abroad, you aren't going to be looking to your politicians for support in that way, and it's going to cause a long-term deficit in any kind of civil responsiveness or civil society. And as far as just the longevity on this, how long can you last? The World Bank says probably until about 2030, and then the benefits of this are going to start petering out. A last thing worth mentioning is it causes extreme risk within Nepal, because if the majority of your workers are going to Qatar, Saudi Arabia, anything else, and a new bill passes in Saudi Arabia that says, actually, we don't want your workers here anymore, now you've got a lot of young workers who have to find a new place to go in the world, who do not speak any of the languages that are there. It can cause a complete upset when 30% of your GDP is based on a handful of countries being able to provide you with work. So that brings us to the question of what can be done in Nepal. How can Nepal continue to move forward with human development? And I believe what's going to have to happen is they're going to have to start modeling a lot of other developing nations in the world. They're not going to be able to hold this unique position that benefits from remittances so much any longer. They're going to have to shape themselves around a export-oriented growth strategy. That's what we've seen lift most developing nations out of the low-income trap and move them into a middle-income status. Now, getting to that point is going to once again be a little bit unique for Nepal because Nepal is sandwiched between India and China. Nepal is not going to be able to outcompete India or China on general agricultural goods. They're not going to be able to outcompete them on telecom. They're not going to be able to outcompete them on most of the things that other nations have used to lift themselves out of poverty. That being said, they do have some really strong competitive advantages that they're going to have to capitalize on. Specifically, in three of the things that I would put forward, the first one is on agriculture. So right now, Nepal spends a lot of time growing rice and wheat. Nepal is terrible at growing rice and wheat. But when you consider the shape of the road systems, if you look at the seeds they have access to, it's the best choice for the farmers. You don't want a bunch of crops that are, high-value fruits and things sitting on a road and then rotting before they can actually get to market. Rice is more of a secure bet for them. So what needs to happen in that is that Nepal needs to engage with its farmers to figure out what the barriers are to them getting high-value crops. Because Nepal is perfect for growing cut flowers, it's perfect for growing high-value fruits and things that China and India are actually significantly worse at producing. So China and India can capitalize on their rice and wheat markets and start producing less of those fruits with the demand, and Nepal can shift into those markets if the communication is there. Another area within agriculture is the sanitary and phytosanitary measures that are required for trading your goods on the international market with the WTO. As it stands, Nepal has a major deficit of human capital and the skill and expertise to actually get their fruits to market. So even if they were growing this, even if they could get them on the roads, at the moment they have no lead standards. So there's nobody that's testing the foods that are coming out of Nepal for lead, and that means a lot of countries will not allow those goods onto their market. So that has to be addressed, and that's going to have to be addressed through international standards organizations. A second area that they really need to look into is going to be reformation of different business laws. Specifically, a good area to look that seems, well, I wouldn't go so far as to say an easy fix because it's politics, but within the transport sector, there are organizations of licensing regimes for buses and transport which grant exclusive rights to family-owned bus businesses and transport networks. And this has resulted in massive inefficiencies and high costs, as demonstrated by the fact that their average farmer is reporting that 50% of the cost of getting their goods to market is just the transport. In comparative countries that are mountainous and landlocked, et cetera, it's 9%. So those kind of costs are enormous, and they're once again going to limit any kind of competitiveness for Nepal. These kind of inefficiencies stretch through all different sectors with logistics, transport, any kind of licensing regimes, and if Nepal is able to tackle those, they can expect a good amount of growth to come from it. The last area to look into is going to be hydropower, and as it currently stands in Nepal, hydropower is being tapped for 2% of what is actually available there. And this is going to be, sorry, I'm looking through my notes so I can get this exactly right. So Nepal has about 43,000 megawatts of economically viable hydropower, and they're only exploiting about 2% of this. Now, this is while only about 75% of the population has access to electricity, and power cuts are actually consuming up to 17 hours a day outside of Kathmandu. For peak domestic demand for electricity hours, it's sitting around 1,250 megawatts. And it's expected with that big of a difference between the production and what's actually being used there, they could become a battery of South Asia, as far as they could start selling their electricity both into the Tibet and into the northern areas of India. So what's been estimated on this is that bringing this to market would cost them about $26.5 billion, or roughly 120% of Nepal's GDP over the next 12 years. But it's estimated that it can return significantly more than that, up to 4% of their GDP. So an increase of 4% would be enough by 2030 to move, or by 2035 to move Nepal into the middle income growth level. And why we want middle income, I've been saying this over and over. You want them to move into middle growth from low income because that is where a country becomes significantly less vulnerable to slipping back into the lowest income levels of poverty. As it stands now, as a low income nation, if Nepal were to have another massive earthquake, it would be a devastating and possibly something that would set them back for 30 or 40 years. So that said, let's hope that Nepal can get these things tackled. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. So we are slightly over time, so I'm just going to ask one question. I'm going to ask it to John, since he was the last one to go, which is, you just mentioned a lot about hydropower. Is there any concern with that type of plan that climate change could undo any investments, that hydropower could maybe not be as good of an investment if climate change affects the glaciers melt faster or change the hydro patterns in the country?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So one of the big things with Nepal, since they're only taking 2% of what's actually available for that hydropower, you've got a really wide portfolio of projects. And there's a large number of those that you might not want to engage with if climate change is going to be as severe as people expect. But the portfolio is so large that it's just going to reduce your options. There's still a large number of dams that could be put up that don't seem to be as susceptible to climate change.
Awesome. I believe now we're going to take a 15-minute break before our next panel begins at 10:15. Yeah? Excellent. We'll see you all in 15 minutes.
Good morning, everybody, for a second time. So we are the panel on, I'm John Poor. I'm going to be moderating the panel on constitutionalism and governance in Nepal. And to give you a brief introduction as to what this means, Nepal, it's an incredibly diverse nation. It's got 3 major religions and 13 recognized national languages in addition to innumerable ethnic groups. And if you're familiar at all with constitutional development, this can make things a bit difficult. So that being said, in 68 years, Nepal has experienced 7 different constitutions. Each constitution is built on the last, improving access and rights, but each has had critical flaws. So 2015 is the latest iteration of a constitution, and like its predecessors, it breaks barriers. It's one of the most progressive constitutions ever adopted in the world, but it has issues. So that's what this panel is going to be all about. Each of our panelists is going to spend roughly 8 to 10 minutes speaking about a particular aspect of the new constitution, and once they've all spoken, we're going to go ahead and move into Q&A. So with that, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists with a short bio, and then I'll let Stephanie take it away. So first, we've got Stephanie Sepulveda. Sorry. And she's a second-year master's candidate concentrating in international law and organizations with a minor in Latin American studies. She graduated summa cum laude from the Florida International University with a bachelor's in international relations and a bachelor's in science and mass communication with a minor in political science and certificates in European studies and Latin American and Caribbean studies. Yeah, she was born in Venezuela. Her interest in international affairs began as she witnessed the deteriorating political situation in that country, which motivated her to pursue a career related to issues of human rights, development, and international cooperation. Her most recent professional experience includes an internship with the Smithsonian's Institute Office of International Relations, where she manages budgetary, financial, and administrative components of several projects, including a U.S.-aid Smithsonian collaboration to promote development in Armenia. Samuel Davidoff Gore is a first-year Sci student concentrating in international law and organizations. He graduated from Brown University in 2015 with honors, concentrating in international relations. Before attending SAIS, Sam worked years at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, an international non-governmental organization that provides technical electoral assistance around the world. At IFES, he worked on the Jordan and Libya teams, helping manage several multi-million-dollar USG-funded projects aimed at building the capacity of local electoral management bodies and promoting inclusive elections. Before working at IFES, Sam interned at a progressive national security think tank and worked on a Senate campaign in Maryland. Academically, he's interested in refugees, migration, ethnic conflict, and the role of international organizations in human rights promotion. And last but not least is David Hamburger. David is a second-year SAIS MA student with a concentration in international law and organizations. His research interests include human rights law and international criminal law, and his past research as a Woodrow Wilson Research Fellow at Johns Hopkins has focused on populism, human rights, and minority populations in Europe. David holds a bachelor's in international studies in medicine, science, and the humanities from Johns Hopkins University, where he was a Hudson Trust Scholar. So that said, I'd like to turn the floor over to Stephanie, who's going to speak about Nepal in transition, the challenges of reconciling changing laws and historical traditions.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. My research interest in Nepal had to do with how the new constitution affected vulnerable groups and how the government was ensuring that the new progressive laws of the constitution were successfully implemented, especially considering the new federalist system that was implemented in Nepal, where the government was divided into 3 levels: a federal level, a municipal level, and a local level. I think a little bit of background is important to understand the transition that Nepal is going through. Nepal has experienced roughly 30 years of instability. You know, there was a civil war, there was a series of constitutions, like John mentioned. And finally, a federal republic was established in 2008. Even with the establishment of the republic, it was very difficult to come to political consensus because of the diverse political interests and different religious groups, social groups that exist in Nepal. That being said, the 2015 earthquake kind of served as a catalyst for the implementation of a new constitution. And it was successfully implemented, like John said, a very progressive constitution, beautifully written, a lot of human rights standards and a lot of protections, but it was not successfully implemented to this day. So how I looked at it was that there's 2 main issues with implementation. One is the logistical issue with how the constitution can be implemented when there's a lack of infrastructural capacity. And a lack of government capacity in reconciling laws across 3 levels of society. We have to understand that Nepal is a very rural country. There is lack of education. There are significant geographic barriers between different regions of the country. So it becomes very difficult to implement laws across such a vast territory and such a geographically diverse territory. Furthermore, there is kind of a discrepancy between local laws, municipal laws, and federal laws, which the government is working on fixing, but it's very difficult. The greater challenge, though, I think, is a cultural challenge. Although there are many progressive laws, that doesn't mean that there's cultural acceptance for these laws. Historical traditions often clash with the new laws, and it becomes a problem. So, for example, if you look at vulnerable groups, women, racial minorities, the different cases that, although they're outlawed in Nepal, the practice is still very common, they tend to be the most affected. So, for example, if you look at women, although the new constitution has significant protections for women, women continue to be victims of a practice called chapari, which is a practice where menstruating women are banished to huts outside of the house because they're considered impure. This is a religious practice. It has been outlawed in Nepal. The constitution makes it illegal. But just this past January, a woman and her 2 children died in one of these menstruation huts. So the conflict comes in whether is it lack of understanding of the laws, is it lack of willingness to implement the laws because religion sometimes may trump legality, or is it just the lack of infrastructure to be able to enforce these laws in the most remote areas of Nepal? Furthermore, lack of education. women, vulnerable groups, often do not know what their protections are. They do not know what their rights are. They don't know what their legal recourse is. And although there are legal recourses in Nepal, and we do have to commend them for that, they're not readily available because of this lack of knowledge. Similarly, there is political and cultural kind of dissatisfaction with the Constitution because certain groups, predominantly the traditionally higher caste in Nepal, are still in positions of power politically, economically, and the lower caste are still very much marginalized in society, even though it's technically outlawed by the Constitution. So it presents a series of problems of implementation, capacity building, lack of education, and of course, lack of willingness. You know, in a society that is such a young democracy, almost only a decade of democracy, it's very difficult to transmit this kind of transformation to society. And it becomes extremely difficult when a society lacks education, lacks access to basic resources, and lacks financial resources to do so. Furthermore, there are challenges that come from having kind of a divide in the government. Although the Constitution was passed by a majority, there was a certain group, a certain political group that was not part of the negotiations, and they have kind of presented a lack of, like a challenge to the new Constitution that has delegitimized it to a certain extent. So there are a lot of challenges. I think it's a good step. It's a step in the right direction. And sometimes in developing countries, we set standards that are just as high as countries that have had democracies for 50, 100 years. And considering the youth of this democracy, they're on the right track. But of course, there's still challenges that remain. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So with that, I want to turn the floor over to Sam, who's going to be presenting a paper called Challenges and Opportunities for Civil Legal Aid in Nepal, and it explores the role of elites in determining the completeness of implementation.
Wrong paper. That's David's.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading the wrong one.
Fascinating topic, though.
That is an absolutely fascinating topipic. My apologies. I managed to duplicate mine in my notes. So actually, I'm going to just go ahead and say, Sam, why don't you introduce your paper, and then go ahead and tell us about it.
Absolutely. The actual title, I honestly don't remember, but it's in the programs. So first, thanks, Stephanie. I think that's actually a really great transition. I think you ended on a fairly optimistic note. I think I would take a bit more pessimistic approach to the subject. So my paper and my interest is about what I call the success disparity between constitutionalism in Nepal and transitional justice. So one of the things that I saw in a lot of different meetings is that the Constitution, while there was recognition that it was imperfect, that there were a lot of issues with it, it was still this really great progressive thing. And look, they took all this time to negotiate, and they came out with a document that 90% of the Constituent Assembly supported. And yeah, there are issues with implementation, but we're going to, as the international community, we're going to support it. We're going to help them hold their elections. We're going to make sure that everything is running in order. We're going to invest a lot of energy into this. When you think about transitional justice in Nepal, it's basically the complete opposite. It's taken so long. Oh, they're not, it doesn't comply with international standards. Oh, there's so many issues with it. It's so politicized. They're never going to do anything. We're not going to deal with it. And yet both the Constitution and transitional justice were promised in the 2006 Comprehensive Peace Agreement. The CPA, and both took until 2015 to implement. So why are there these two different narratives between the Constitution, success of the Constitution, and success of transitional justice? So that was fascinating to me. So the CPA gave Nepal 60 days to promulgate a new constitution and to deliver on the promise of transitional justice, which is an incredibly short deadline that they absolutely did not meet. It took them about a year and a half, or a year to a year and a half, to have promulgated a new interim constitution and to hold elections for the first Constituent Assembly, which were in 2008. They were won by the Maoist parties. Basically, one of the warring factions was now in control of the government. The Constituent Assembly deliberated for 3 years. They had their mandate extended by an additional year, and then they couldn't come up with anything. So there were new Constituent Assembly elections, and the power shifted to another one of the warring parties who now took control. But there was really no kind of impetus to actually get the Constitution passed for 8 years following the end of the conflict. You see a very similar trajectory with the promise of transitional justice. The CPA promised a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as part of its transitional justice mechanisms. A year later, there had been no progress, and so the Nepali Supreme Court ordered that the government start doing something, and the government kind of ignored that. Then the Supreme Court issued another order saying you actually have to do something. The government issued a bill that established a commission of investigation and provided the framework for potential Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it didn't comply with any really best practices or international standards. It was more focused at protecting the people in power with amnesty provisions, et cetera. And so there was a huge protest from people who looked at it and said, this isn't transitional justice. This is just protecting yourselves. So basically, there's this back and forth with the government would keep proposing new things, and then it would kind of get bottled up in the legislature, and then the Supreme Court every so often would step in and say, no, you actually have to do something, and the government would kind of ignore it. Then there was an exogenous shock to the system. In 2014, the United Kingdom arrested a Nepali colonel in the United Kingdom, exercising what's known as universal jurisdiction. Basically, the UK doesn't really have any standing to try the colonel, except that he was accused of crimes against humanity, and Nepal was unwilling or unable to actually prosecute the colonel. So that was kind of this wake-up call to Nepal, saying, well, if we want to actually control our own process, we have to do something. So after that, the government finally brought forward a transitional justice mechanism establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and a Commission on Enforced Disappearances. At the same time, a couple months later, or a year later, you have the Nepali earthquake, which, as Stephanie mentioned, was a catalyst for this constitution. So, 6 months after that or so, in September, they actually promulgated the Constitution. So looking at it from this perspective, it's really interesting to see that both, without these two exogenous shocks, you probably wouldn't have had either. And who knows, in 2019 now, whether they would have had an effective constitution or any transitional justice mechanism. Now, the thing with Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and transitional justice mechanisms is that they're a direct threat to the people in power in this case. Both the Maoists and the government during the Civil War would be direct, for any effective transitional justice mechanism to occur, their power would be threatened. They would be accused of war crimes. They would be under investigation, and they don't want that. So they have a vested interest in making sure that they are undercutting the transitional justice mechanisms by having a weak mandate, by not funding it adequately, by not giving them the proper human resources. Where the Constitution, they can kind of hamstring it in more subtle ways. So, for example, with the new federal system, there's this body that's supposed to allocate the funds to each of the federal levels. That hasn't been formed yet, and they're dragging their feet as much as possible to prevent that from being formed. You have this list of concurrent powers, where saying what is devolved to each level, but basically all of them are concurrent with the federal government, so the federal government still has a lot of power that the municipal and state governments should have. But that's much more innocuous and much less visible than having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that has 60,000 inquiries and hasn't adjudicated a single case. So I think I'll stop there. But I think hopefully you have a bit of a sense of why there's such a big disparity between how people talk about the Constitution, how Nepalis, work with, and then more importantly, the international community work with the Nepali government to implement the Constitution, but for transitional justice, say basically, well, we're not going to deal with that because it's just so out of line with any international best practice.
All right, thank you, Sam. So now we'll turn to David and talk about challenges and opportunities for civil legal aid in Nepal. Great. I'm not going to reintroduce it.
That's fine. Thanks, John, and thanks to Stephanie and Sam, and thanks to you all for coming. So I'll give maybe 3 brief points. The first is an overview of what civil legal aid means in the context of Nepal and more broadly. The second, I'll be an optimist like Stephanie and talk about opportunities, and then I'll be a pessimist like Sam and talk about challenges. Maybe I'll do challenges and then opportunities. So the basic idea of civil legal aid, as most of you probably know, is that there are 2 legal systems, a criminal system in the civil system, and in the United States, it seems kind of obvious to us that people who face criminal charges have a right to counsel. And if they can't afford a right to counsel, the state will provide it for them. That seems like a basic constitutional right, and it is. Although, even though that was enshrined in the Constitution in the 1790s, it actually wasn't made accessible or effective until Gideon in the 1960s. So I say that just to say that the gap between promises that Stephanie talked about and efficacy can be really big, even in the most developed countries where we imagine there are model legal codes. And so when we talk about kind of a relative assessment of progress, as Stephanie mentioned, we should keep in mind the track record of countries like the United States. So with that in mind, I'll talk briefly about civil legal aid, which is that second component, which even we don't have in the United States. The idea that if you face a case of a land dispute or a divorce, or any civil case that doesn't involve criminal charges brought against you by the state, you have no right to counsel. And that's certainly true in the United States. It was true until the 1970s in Europe, when the European Court of Human Rights determined that was a violation of human rights, that just like you need to have a lawyer in a criminal case, you must have access to a lawyer in a civil case as long as there's a basic threshold that's met. And so when John mentions that the Nepali Constitution of 2015 is progressive and remarkably progressive, he's absolutely right, because this type of provision of a universal civil legal aid requirement for people meeting a poverty threshold is ambitious by any standard, and it's certainly ambitious by the standards of a country that has had a constitutional experiment that hasn't gone swimmingly over the past couple of years. So I think it's worth keeping in mind both the tremendous promise that this has if it goes well, and also the serious difficulties that Nepal faces in making this promise a reality. So I'll read you briefly Article 20 sub 10 from the 2015 Constitution, which says that there is, quote, the right to free legal aid as provided for by law. And that sounds great. It's essentially what we've just said is an extraordinarily ambitious promise. And it is great, but it has two main challenges that I think we observed when we were in Nepal in November. The first is the challenge of letting people know that they have this right, the challenge of education, and I think Stephanie put that very well. It's one thing to promise a right, it's one thing even for that right to be effective, but if people don't know that they can claim the right, it is essentially completely ineffective. But the second challenge is where in the political landscape that Sam has described this right lies. And so Sam has cogently talked about how important the Supreme Court has been in pushing the government of Nepal to really enact the promises it has made. And there's a little provision in this 20 sub 10 portion that is a challenge to the Supreme Court's ability to do that. And that's the last three words which say the last four words, provided for by law. So that sounds really good. It sounds like, well, if there's a law that allows or enacts this constitutional provision, everything will be fine. But what actually that does is, like the right to a safe environment and like the right to education, both of which are also in the 2015 Constitution, it makes the provision of an absolute right actually subject to the federal system of law implementation, which comes not out of Parliament or out of the Supreme Court, but out of the Ministry of Law, Justice, and Parliamentary Affairs. And so, in effect, what some commentators have criticized about this particular provision is that it takes something that looks like a fundamental right and converts it into a right that is a right only when politically expedient. And so we have to be mindful of those two challenges. The structural legal challenge, is this actually a right, even though it looks like it? And the secondary challenge, is this an effective right if people don't know that they have access to the right? And so that was kind of the focus of my research and discussions when we were in Nepal. And so giving you a little bit of context briefly on some of the basic challenges. For civil legal aid particularly, the situation is really quite acute. There is one legal aid attorney in Nepal for every 154,000 people in the population. You can imagine that there are circumstances of a divorce or a land dispute or any sort of basic civil claim that far exceed the capacity that provides. And in terms of spending on legal aid in Nepal, again, considering that the government is saying we're going to provide this as an absolute right to people, spending is less than 1 US cent per person in the legal aid budget. So those are two of the really important structural challenges that are being faced on the ground as well. So having said that, I think I've spoken enough pessimistically. I'll talk briefly optimistically. Two reasons to be optimistic about civil legal aid in Nepal. The first is that the funding issue has been recognized and there has been good cooperation between the international community on one hand, the Nepali government on the other hand, I suppose I now have three heads, and the general NGO community. So that's one good thing. The Norwegian government partnered with UNDP for a 3-year project, $4.6 million to fund civil legal aid in Nepal. And so that's one cause for optimism. And so is potentially the centralization of a currently 3-tiered system, grassroots in the courts, a local system and a federal system, combining that under one tier. If that can be done effectively and not politically, I think that's a cause for optimism. So that's certainly one. The other one is the growth of a sort of a barefoot paralegal type system. This is a program that has been tried successfully in India in some cases and in Nepal as well. There are non-governmental organizations like Namati that are working to provide people not with legal training per se, or not with legal degrees, but just with basic legal training to go out and help with sort of entry-level disputes where people might have a legitimate claim but not the resources to find an attorney. So those are 2 reasons for optimism. I'll throw in one more. We met with the Kathmandu School of Law, and we were shown the important impact that the growing interest in law following the Constitution's promulgation has had. And so to the extent that more people are interested in being lawyers and more people are given access to legal education, I think there's reason for optimism that that will trickle down into access for the general population as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you all for the great presentations. We have plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and take the privileges of the moderator to ask the first question. Sam, I'm really curious. So understanding that the elite of Nepal have allowed for the passage of the Constitution because it poses fewer risks to them, can you really imagine a situation in which a meaningful pursuit of transitional justice can occur?
Sure, yeah. So obviously, when we were there, it was difficult because, I mean, so we visited the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Nepal, and we had just come from the Ministry of Law and Parliamentary Affairs, Justice, Law and Parliamentary Affairs, and the difference between those two institutions was kind of staggering. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was kind of hidden in this little corner next to a police station, I think prison, there as well. Had very little amenities whatsoever. Very few staff, or certainly, and certainly the staff member we had been interacting with apparently hadn't informed them of a meeting. It was very kind of last minute, haphazard, and you could just hear the pain in we spoke to 2 of the commissioners, the pain in their voice that they weren't able to do anything about this, and it really seemed kind of like a hopeless situation for them. And so on one hand, I would say no, as long as the facts on the ground are as they are, the elites aren't going to let any transitional justice effort occur. However, that would be, I think, too pessimistic, and I think too ignorant of the kind of pressures that can allow it to work. So first, there's grassroots pressure. There is, I think, as we were there were newspaper articles about all these different protests and complaints against the government asking for more effective transitional justice. And so if there is enough domestic pressure, then certainly the elites will recognize the threat to their political power and may implement a more positive transitional justice mechanism. The international community can also apply more pressure. They've chosen instead to disengage from the process entirely. So if they were to re-engage and perhaps link it with other issues, then elites may be able to change their mindset. However, as we learned, the Nepali government has a lot of power actually with the international community. And they are, it's not a situation where the international community and the development organizations and donor governments can come in and say, okay, well, we have the proper system and you have to do this, otherwise we're going to withhold aid. It's not the relationship that they have. And so I don't think the international community has nearly as much sway as the domestic population does.
Great, thank you. So because we've got enough time, I want to open it to the floor for any burning questions, and if there's nothing out there, I've definitely got more that I can ask. Please. Oh, we've got a microphone coming for you.
I know that Nepal is between India and China is basically against communism, and India, Modi is pretty independent. So I just wonder, in terms of our education or background, population, religion, state, and their social cultural concept, whether that's total capitalism or total communism, and then the overseas scholars that go back to Nepal or they stay outside.
Well, I'm happy to talk a little bit about this. I have to say that this is not an area about which I know very much. But I think what was fascinating to us was the influence of both India and China in Nepal. And I know that the previous panel addressed this in part. When we were there, I think there are significant projects, for example, that are being funded by the Chinese government. We passed on the way several times buildings that were being financed by China Aid, in part as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so I think that there is clearly an influence, economic as well as perhaps political there. I don't know if the other panelists want to add points.
Yeah, I would add that I think just being in Nepal, you can see that the influence of India, I think, is much culturally greater than the influence of China. And I think on the ground, when we spoke to people there, I think Nepal sees itself as inextricably linked to India to a certain extent, although there is kind of this animosity of like Nepal has to be independent because of certain historical tensions with India, including the embargo after the earthquake and situations like that. That being said, the influence, like David, the influence of China, I think, is growing. Politically, the government, politically, the governments are possibly more alike, but culturally, Nepal is very, very tied to India, I would say.
And just on your last point about students going abroad, I think what was interesting when we visited the Kathmandu University School of Law, they provide, after the students finish that program, they are supposed to go abroad for further education. And one of the questions we had was, how do you get them to come back? And so a lot of them do stay abroad. Nepal has a huge diaspora, and so I think there's ongoing efforts to try to, get, for example, the law students to have internships with lawyers in Kathmandu or in Nepal, and so you form that link. So you make sure that they have employment opportunities when they get back to Nepal. But it's definitely an ongoing issue, and I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon.
Great. Thank you for that excellent question. Do we have any more questions? Please, Tiffany.
Thank you. I have two questions, if I may. One is for Sam and one is for David. So, sorry, okay. Stephanie. Sam, could you speak about transitional justice in light of recent developments, like the extension of the transitional justice mechanisms for another year? But also, I read I think it was an Al Jazeera article that there was a recent bombing in Kathmandu by a Maoist group of telecommunications. Nope. Anyway.
You might have read it.
I read it. Okay. And then my second question is for David, and just where does the right to counsel for civil issues fall within the direction of international law? U.S. says no, Europeans say yes, but the Europeans kind of say yes to a lot of human rights. So where's the wind blowing on that?
Sure. I'll start, I guess. So the issue with extending the transitional justice mechanisms by a year is that it doesn't really give much confidence to the people and comfort that it's actually going to do anything. Transitional justice mechanisms, when done correctly, need a lot of time, and you can't limit them to these 1 or 2 year mandates, because then when you're planning, you can't have these expansive plans. Otherwise, you're going to let a lot of work, not get done. Or in Nepal's case, they were prepared to just have these 60,000 cases and not have any incidences. So a 1 year extension is not going to do much. Additionally, it seems like the people have lost confidence in the current Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was, by the way, all the commissioners were appointed were former politicians. They had to resign from the party, but they were all each from different parties. So it's inherently they're politicians at their core, which I think also means that there's less confidence. And really, one of the interesting things that one of the commissioners said was that the people have bypassed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they're taking their complaints directly to the government. So I don't see how a year extension of the current mechanism is going to ameliorate that.
A brief excursus on the future of international law. So I think the general trajectory is in favor of recognizing, at least in certain pressing cases, civil legal aid as something that is a determinant of a just system or an unjust system, of access to law or lack of access. The ECHR case I referenced, Erie v. Ireland in 1979, used the terms that law must be safeguarded in a, quote, real and practical way. And so their claim was that to say that we have equal access to law under the, in this case, the European Convention of Human Rights, but not to provide for civil legal counsel, in this case, an attorney for a relatively violent divorce, was a lack of access to law, effectively, and therefore a violation of human rights. In terms of other countries following that lead, in the US there has been a campaign for what's called Civil Gideon for a while, as I'm sure you know, trying to move the protections under Gideon v. Wainwright into the civil sphere as well. There are certainly legal aid programs that are working tirelessly recognizing the import of those types of things. And what people may not understand about civil cases is that it can be things like losing your home due to a tax sale or a bill that can't be paid to the city. And so these have fundamental, long-lasting effects on development outcomes, and in the case of Nepal, they also bear heavily on people's perspectives of the success of transitional justice. If you say this constitution is going to hold up for the world an example of our success in promoting transitional justice, and you fail to meet those basic principles, you undermine not only Article 20 sub 10, you undermine belief in the entire system. And so I think that's something that developing countries and certainly other countries around the world have recognized as well. I think there are 4 countries, Stephanie is going to know this better than I do, but I think there are 4 countries in Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Costa Rica that have all both recognized the importance of civil legal aid and have rural public defender programs that do not only civil but also criminal, again, recognizing that import. And in Africa, there's an emerging acceptance of this, I think. In 2016, UNDP commissioned a report on the status of legal aid. One final Asian example, in Indonesia, there was a 2011 law that provided for civil legal aid, but put it under the Ministry of Justice. And so again, there's the question of political commitment and, more importantly, financial commitment to that type of thing that everybody agrees would be a good idea.
Great. Thank you both. So I'm going to take the privilege of the microphone one more time, and I would like to ask a question of Stephanie. You talked at length about the Chaudhry institution in Nepal, and it seems, if I'm interpreting you wrong, feel free to correct me, but that you believe the government needs to have a stronger enforcement mechanism in the rural areas on these types of practices. And I'm really curious, considering that the Nepalese government is in a fragile state and it's demonstrating signs of fragility, do you have any suggestions for how they could kind of crack down on these traditions in a way that maintains the peace?
Yeah, well, it's very difficult, of course, because it's difficult to kind of re-educate a society or kind of reinstate values that maybe didn't exist or that are so deeply rooted in cultural and religious traditions. I think the most important thing to do is capacity building. The government of Nepal, all things considered, has still very weak democratic institutions. I think it's in the 18th percentile in terms of government effectiveness and in the 27th percentile in terms of rule of law. So it's still considerably weak. So I think institution building, getting confidence in the government, all things that I think David and Sam mentioned, it takes time, but it should be done. And then most importantly, I think education and outreach to vulnerable groups and rural communities. So it's not just women, it's racial minorities, religious minorities, social and geopolitical minorities that are so vulnerable and live in these very rural populations that are so separated from Kathmandu that really don't have access. So I think outreach, education, and partnering with civil society organizations and NGOs to kind of bring knowledge of the laws and of kind of trying to change these cultural practices from the bottom up. And I think an anecdote, when we were in Nepal, we spoke to someone who was telling us about how the provinces were divided. And I think one of the provinces, to get there, you have to fly, then you have to drive, and then you have to walk, because there is no road to drive to get to this province. So considering kind of like how divided the country is geographically and with the lack of infrastructure, bringing roads, bringing sanitation, bringing water, all these things contribute to a more robust society from the bottom up that maybe can work to institute these changes. And of course, just education at all levels.
Thank you very much. So we are out of time for questions. Feel free to approach the scholars afterwards with anything additional that you've got, and we'll take a short break. Thank you so much.
Are we not going to 11?
Oh, are we supposed to go to 11?
Yes.
I thought we have plenty of time for more questions. I thought we were going until 10:55. Please, back in the back. Thank you. I get the Moderator of the Year award.
You're doing well. You're doing great.
You have at least one panelist with good
I'm going to ask Stephanie last, but that's the main issue I'd like to, my question's going to be addressed to. Sam, you mentioned the arrest of the colonel by Britain, and yet you didn't, how shall I say, expand on the influence of Britain on Nepal, and especially the Gurkhas. So when they arrested the colonel, it was a huge development in Nepal itself to say that everybody can be held accountable to the law. David, you talked about civil rights in Nepal, but civil rights in this country are deteriorating rapidly, especially under this current administration. So for all three of you, I'd like to know what impact developments in this country from this last administration is having over there. And for Stephanie, the issue of women and the term you're unclean during your menstrual cycle. That is also true in one of the great faiths, in Judaism, where women have to go through the mikvah and they're considered unclean during that limited period. And in Georgetown itself, we had a huge case a few years back with a rabbi in the Georgetown synagogue photographing women during the mikvah. So I think if you're going to be raising that as a human issue, you need to raise it across the board with all religions. It's practiced rampantly in Africa as well, in some parts of the Middle East and Asia. So I think if you're going to isolate that particular issue to one country, it will come back to haunt you because you're not addressing it across the board.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do you want to start?
Good for him.
I completely agree with you. I think the issue of gender violence, the issue of gender discrimination, the issues particularly of female human rights issues are happening across the board in this country, in every single country in the world. And I think because the focus of this paper was Nepal, that's what I focused on, but same practice occurs in India, same practice occurs in several South Asian countries. I agree with you in Jewish culture and African culture. That being said, I think it's important to note that I'm not trying to judge a religious tradition, but rather implore that there should be safety for women and rights guaranteed. I mean, a woman died in one of these huts. Women are left out to the elements in freezing conditions without access to sanitation, without access to running water, without access to electricity in tin huts. Authorities come in and tear down the huts, and a week later they're in again. So it's not to single out Nepal, but it's to say there are practices that are outlawed, and the government has outlawed these practices, and they continue happening because women are such vulnerable groups that they are often not protected and are often taken advantage of. And I think it's more of a criticism on how laws are implemented, because the protections do exist. They're just not implemented, and it puts the lives and health of women and children in peril.
So I can take a stab at the influence of the impact of the new current U.S. administration, because we asked people that question directly, because it's on all of our minds, I think, as well, as students of IR. And basically, the impact is kind of minimal. The U.S. has kind of not been particularly heavy-handed in their role in Nepal, and so there hasn't been that much policy change, I don't think, between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. for example, with transitional justice, the U.S. has been, pretty hands-off on that anyways. So there's nothing that ideologically the different administrations, the changes in administrations would have impacted. Again, I think it's much more of an international effort than a U.S.-led effort, and I think that is reflected in the fact that the change of administration hasn't particularly impacted it.
I'll just add a brief anecdote. I appreciate your mentioning the impact of the U.S. maybe not only in the context of aid, which I think Sam has addressed, but also in the context of a kind of example. What was quite interesting to me was we spoke with one constitutional scholar who spoke about the increasing politicization of the Supreme Court in Nepal and was describing something that clearly, as students of international law, is concerning to us. The politicization of the judiciary is an attack on the rule of law. And he said, it was sort of with a smile, but of course we've been watching very closely the hearings for then Judge Kavanaugh. And so I suppose that this type of thing happens both in Nepal and in the United States. And so I think that certainly struck me as something that was interesting on two fronts. The first is that these developments in the United States are followed apparently quite closely in Nepal. Now, granted, constitutional scholars in Nepal are probably not the ordinary constituency of people watching Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing, but it is something that's being followed. And the second is that we have a responsibility to consider that our institution is often held up as a model, and therefore that the impact it has is not limited within the borders of the United States alone.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
I have a question, if I may.
Absolutely.
Sure. This is a question for Stephanie.
Great.
So one of the things that was fascinating to me is just the diversity of perspective we got. Recognizing that we were only in Kathmandu, we were speaking to a very limited number of people, but still, between, just depending on who we were speaking to, we got wildly different views of the Constitution. So I was wondering, because you focused more on that, especially the gendered component of that, if you could kind of nuance that a bit and talk a bit about the different perspectives we got and how you viewed that.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think depending on what kind of organization we met with, if we met with the government, if we met with an NGO, if we met with a women's rights organization, if we met with a scholar, we got a huge range of opinions on the Constitution. We got one opinion who said the Constitution was the most beautiful Constitution ever written. When we met with the Ministry of Law and Justice and Parliamentary Affairs, they were extremely excited and extremely proud of the Constitution and of all the protections that it granted. So, for example, when we talk about citizenship laws, we got a wide-ranging way of interpretation of the laws. In the Ministry of Justice, Law and Parliamentary Affairs, they said there is absolutely no problem with the citizenship laws. Women have completely the same rights as men. There is no problem. And if there's a problem, you just take it to court and you fix it. Whereas when we spoke to a women's rights organization that focuses on helping women fight for their rights, we heard this is a huge problem. Women do not have the knowledge of how to address their rights. Women do not have knowledge of their rights, do not have knowledge of their legal recourse. They do not know how to go to court. Local officials are not often cooperative. And in many ways, it's kind of this discrepancy between what's on paper and what's on practice. And I think that was a consistent theme throughout our entire trip, especially when it comes to these rights of vulnerable groups that exist on paper but are not often implemented. And it's not just women, it's minorities. Like I said, in the case system, the rights are there on paper, but it's just very difficult to implement. And the government will say, it's happening, it's all great, we have no issues. And then you speak to international organizations that say, the stateless problem is a real problem, the gender problem is a real problem. So it's kind of, depends who you speak to, but I think that's the nature of politics in any country of the world.
Great. I think that's a good thought to depart on for a good 15-minute break. Again, feel free to approach anyone if you have any questions, and we will reconvene in 15. Thank you.
All right, welcome everyone to panel number 3. For the next 45 minutes, we'll be talking about development in Nepal. My name is Clayton Conley. I'm a second-year MA student in Korea Studies. And before we get started, want to introduce all of our speakers here and maybe let you know a little bit about them. So we'll first be hearing from Chloe Hauenstein, and she will be speaking on fiscal federalism in Nepal, the trajectory for equitable and sustainable decentralization. Next, we'll hear from Lin Xu, who will be speaking on, just a second, sorry. The impact through government accountability, Nepal's new foreign aid management policy. And last, we'll be hearing from Spencer Gross on financial inclusion and citizenship in Nepal. So before we begin, I'd like to read a little bit about each one of these students who will be presenting today. So first, Chloe is a second-year SAIS student concentrating in international development. Prior to attending SAIS, Chloe obtained her bachelor's degree in international relations and psychology from Claremont McKenna College. She then spent 1 year in Delhi, India, as a Fulbright grantee, performing qualitative research on the informal waste management system in New Delhi. Following her Fulbright grant, Chloe worked at Kelton Global, a market research consulting firm in Los Angeles, California, for 2 years. After graduating from SAIS in May, she will be working for the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. All right. Chloe.
Do I go now?
Yeah.
Great. So as Clayton mentioned, the topic of my paper is fiscal federalism in Nepal. So I'll be discussing the importance and process of this fiscal decentralization in the context of Nepal's transition to federalism. So the Constitution introduced in 2015, which has been referenced throughout the past two panels, sought to establish federalism more effectively govern different segments of Nepal's population. A key piece of decentralization is fiscal decentralization, which represents an opportunity to fine-tune budgets and spending policies for local needs. The progress has been criticized by some who believe that the fiscal processes are still too centralized. So my paper also addresses some overarching next steps to improve the process of fiscal decentralization. So I guess to start, just a very quick background on fiscal decentralization. It is the transfer of two key financial responsibilities to lower levels of government, and those two responsibilities are largely expenditure assignment, so how they're kind of spending the money that they have, and revenue collection, which involves taxation and other forms of obtaining revenue to use for that expenditure. And it's largely agreed upon that because subnational governments are closer to the people, they're more capable of meeting citizens' preferences and demands in public goods and services than the central government would be. And particularly in Nepal, it's a very heterogeneous society, and for years it was governed by a unitary system that couldn't adequately represent and support its varied demographics. So in addition to demonstrating Nepal's commitment to a movement away from monarchy, fiscal decentralization is essential for Nepal's development, as it can enhance economic growth, public service delivery, and infrastructure. Studies in Tanzania, South Africa, India, Pakistan, and many other countries have shown a positive correlation between fiscal decentralization and human development indicators, such as life expectancy, per capita income, and infant survival. And in fact, some scholars or many scholars and policymakers say that regional inequality in Nepal was one of the major causes for the need for federalism, and economic literature suggests that public expenditure should be directed more towards the less developed regions in Nepal. So a very quick history of previous attempts at fiscal decentralization in Nepal. In 1999, there was an act called the Local Self-Governance Act, which was introduced, and it was one of the first major attempts at fiscal decentralization. It gave more expenditure and revenue authority to local bodies such as village development committees, municipalities, and district development committees. However, within that LSGA framework, there was a major lack of clarity regarding certain expenditures and revenue assignments, and there were overlapping responsibilities between different levels of government, and they were duplicating a lot of tasks. And there was also issues with capacity building. These lower levels of government weren't prepared to take on this revenue and expenditure assignment, and so slowly the fiscal responsibilities kind of drifted back towards the center, and it became much more centralized again. So the Constitution introduced in 2015 created an entirely new federal structure to make local and provincial governments more meaningful drivers of development and national planning. And as opposed to simply requiring that smaller local entities be given more fiscal power, as was the case with the LSGA, this constitution completely overhauled the governance structure of Nepal and created the National Natural Resources and Fiscal Commission to guide the fiscal transfer and revenue sharing transition. And although it's not quite as controversial as other tasks required for the implementation of the Constitution, which others on these previous panels have discussed, it is notoriously complicated. Fiscal decentralization is in any country, and therefore it's received a lot of criticism. So critics argue that the central government has maintained the main sources of revenue collection, which has limited the independence of local governments, and that they've been very slow to pass bills that actually enable the local governments to kind of to collect revenues and to spend them successfully. And so this has kind of caused fear that there is still this really central tendency towards spending and more largely government in Nepal. And in the content of the bills, the allocation of revenue collection has skewed more towards the central government. So, for example, the new bills allow the central government to collect 85% of taxes from important sectors such as hydropower, mountaineering, and natural resources, with only 5% allocated to local governments and 10% to provincial governments. So, don't want to take too long, but I think, in my perspective, although there has been a lot of criticism, this process really only began in 2015 and with the creation of the Natural Resources and Fiscal Commission more recently towards 2017. And I think it's important for Nepal to kind of take this process a little bit more slowly in order to avoid some of the pitfalls of the 1999 LSGA. They need to ensure that these local governments are actually in a place that they can kind of take on these tasks, or otherwise things will drift more naturally back towards the center again. So there's, I don't think that this current centralization or tendencies towards it in terms of fiscal tasks is too alarming, and there needs to be a lot of capacity building in order to kind of build these locality or local governments up in order to take on this task. And I'm happy to discuss more of that in Q&A, but for now I'll hand it over. Thank you.
All right. So in this period of transition, what practices should Nepal consider as it moves forward with fiscal decentralization to ensure that local governments can fulfill their fiscal responsibilities?
Sorry, I was a little caught off guard there. So first, I think one of the big things is there has to be more clarity about the roles of different governments and different actors. And second, there has to be a lot of capacity building, as I mentioned. So until local governments can take over revenue collection and revenue collection responsibilities, the revenue sharing model between the central government and the local governments must be really clearly understood at all levels. So due to the slow start of the commission, which I mentioned, revenue sharing and transfer allocations are still misaligned, and there hasn't been a lot of progress in that space. For example, the central government has mandated, they have mandates for local governments in what they have to spend on and certain development goals that they need to achieve, but they haven't increased allocation in order to allow these local governments to actually spend effectively on those tasks. And so they're not really in a place to collect revenue, but they also don't have sufficient resources to meet these higher demands that are being asked of them. And so one of the big kind of complicated processes for any fiscal decentralization process is the revenue sharing formula, and kind of trying to figure out, given the kind of the income levels of a certain area, like how much they need to achieve their goals and how that should be transferred over from the central government. And then in terms of capacity building, just making sure that each region kind of has the infrastructure, the human capital, and technological resources necessary to actually collect revenues and spend them effectively.
I have a second question for you, but I'm going to save that for later.
Let's do that.
Next will be, I'll introduce Lin Shu, and we'll hear from her and her topic on impact through government accountability in Nepal's new foreign aid management policy. But before we get into that, a short biography. Lin Shu is a second-year SAIS MA candidate concentrating in international economics and international law and organizations. Before SAIS, she completed her bachelor's degree at Renmin University of China, majoring in international political economy. Interested in international development and nonprofit organizations, she has interned at Oxfam Hong Kong and Global Health Council, two nonprofit organizations that aim to combat poverty and promote global health. During her time at SAIS, she has interned at Russian International Affairs Council, RIAC, as a research assistant working on the analysis of Sino-Russian relationship and contributing to RAC's annual report on Russia foreign relations.
Okay, thank you, Clayton. Thank you for coming. So I'm very excited to share my research on the new Nepal's new foreign aid management policy and how the government strengthens the project, the foreign aid effectiveness through this new foreign aid policy. So a quick background about this policy is this was introduced in 2014. It's called the Development Cooperation Policy, which is also accompanied by assistance from the online aid management platform and also provisions regulating the mobilization of foreign aid in Nepal's new constitution in 2015. So compared with the previous foreign aid policy implemented in 2003, the new foreign aid policy, developed cooperation policy, has endorsed more rigid standards regarding the volume and the sectors of foreign aid. Under the development cooperation policy, the mobilization of foreign aid should be aligned with priorities of the state. Also, particularly industries with high knowledge values and ensuring sustainable development. As I mentioned before, this new foreign aid policy is also accompanied by an online aid management platform, which is called AMP. Basically, it's a website like you can download all Excel spreadsheet about those development projects in Nepal. You can, like everyone has access to the website. You could find out what development partners are and where those projects are located, and also what's their budget. It's quite fascinating because you can view in-depth reports on a wide range of aid trends and about those details. So basically, it is a part of government's commitment to transparency, accountability, and aid effectiveness as well. I found it interesting because when we were in Nepal, we talked with experts from USAID, and the local experts told us one problem with China's foreign aid is that actually local people and like experts, they don't know what China is doing there, and they don't know where money goes to. But actually, this is a very good like website to know all of those information. But I do have problems. Like when I was doing my research, there was like a couple times I couldn't access the website. Maybe they have some like technology like problems. Another new arrangement is the Nepal's new constitution in 2015, which emphasizes the chief role of federal government in foreign aid mobilization. And it regulates that the federal government should take the lead in mobilizing foreign aid, and provincial and local governments could only use or obtain foreign grants or loans with the consent of the federal government. So this has brought some challenges. first one is the new foreign aid policy has directly exerted negative effects on citizens' welfare because the new foreign aid policy has some standards regarding the volumes and the sectors. So those projects that do not meet those standards could not be implemented. And actually, those small projects directly contribute to citizens' education, healthcare, and some basic benefits of their lives. And also, the local and provincial authorities have voiced their concerns over their limited autonomy to use those foreign aid, and they're less likely to meet their development aspirations. Another challenge is that the new foreign aid policy has influenced the development of local NGOs because basically local NGOs are mainly carrying out projects of poverty alleviation and good governance, election, healthcare, and those funding are mostly from foreign aid, bilateral and multilateral foreign aid. So right now, local NGOs are confronted by the challenges of registration and approval from the government. Although there are many challenges that Nepal is faced with, I still think currently the new foreign aid policy is going towards the right direction of capacity building and increasing government's accountability and transparency because compared with Nepal's neighbors like China and India, it has like smaller market and population. So if it wants to attract more foreign aid investment, it has to build up a better government with stronger capacity and accountability. So I think right now Nepal government has to think about how to more efficiently and effectively carry out those foreign aid projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next, we'll hear from Spencer Gross on financial inclusion and citizenship in Nepal. Briefly, a little bit about Spencer. He's a second-year SAIS student concentrating in international political economy with a minor in Korea studies and a specialization in emerging markets. Before SAIS, he managed the customer success team at GoGuardian, a startup educational technology firm in Los Angeles, for 3 years. He graduated from the George Washington University, magna cum laude, in 2013 with a BA in political science. During his time at SAIS, he has worked at the U.S. Commerce Department in the International Trade Administration's Office of Finance and Insurance Industries. Currently, he focuses on studying the fintech, AI, and cybersecurity.
Thank you, Clayton. So, as Clayton mentioned today, I'm talking about the intersection of citizenship laws and financial inclusion in Nepal. And as was mentioned in an earlier panel, Nepal gets about a third of its current GDP from remittances. And so this is incredibly important because it colors everything that has to do with the Nepalese economy, whether it comes to financial inclusion, and as you'll see, citizenship laws as well. And just to give a small anecdote from our time, I hadn't, as most people do when you travel, you don't really think about it. We had a pretty long travel itinerary to Nepal. Ours included a 17-hour layover in Abu Dhabi. And the flight from DC to Abu Dhabi was pretty normal in terms of the composition of the people on the plane. I didn't really notice it all, families, pretty mixed, some Western tourists, people traveling. But when I sat down on the flight from Abu Dhabi to Kathmandu, the first thing I noticed was that 90%, or at least in my eyes, 90% of that plane was young men, people who were in their early to mid-20s, including the person next to me who I had a small conversation with in English, and we got to talking about what he was doing, why was he on this plane from Abu Dhabi to Nepal? And he was coming back from Kuwait, where he had just spent 2 years working as a barista, as a guest worker. And this was the first time I realized how many people work abroad, especially in the Gulf, to send remittances back home to Nepal. He had a young wife and child back in Nepal. He had been away for 2 years. And he hadn't seen his family in that time. He was using all of his money to send back to Nepal. So this was his end of his 2-year stint. And it just goes to show you how much time and effort it goes into when people go abroad for remittances. So 80% of these, as John mentioned in the earlier panel, about 1 out of 2 families in Nepal receives these remittances. 80% of these remittances are sent to rural households, in fact. And about 57% of those remittances actually just go to basic goods. They just go to food and services and other things needed for survival. They're not in large part going to expanding the economy. And at a macro level, as has also been mentioned earlier, this has created a huge trade deficit within Nepal because people buy imported goods a lot of times for these. So this is a big macro problem for Nepal. But on the financial side, right, obviously the easiest way to send remittances back is through formal financial methods, right, through money transfers. There are informal ways to do this through money lenders whose names I cannot remember off the top of my head. But obviously, working through informal channels has costs, or just saving all that money in a lump sum to bring back with you in cash. These have costs. So in a way, remittances have been really good for financial inclusion. It's increased the number of bank accounts that are used. But on the ground, as we've seen in a lot of talks today, the reality on the ground is a lot different. So the World Bank estimates that about 52% of all bank accounts in Nepal are what's called mailbox accounts. All that's done with these accounts is that somebody sends money into them from abroad, person goes to the bank or a mobile money or some form of withdrawal, takes the money out, and they never touch that bank account ever again. So they're not actually fully included in the system. So when we talk, so it's a good starting point. It gets people associated with the formal financial system, but it doesn't get people fully in the door. But the big problem here is one of citizenship. So as we talked earlier today, the citizenship laws of Nepal are pretty good on paper. There are some substantial loopholes. One of the biggest loopholes is that if, to my knowledge, if you are a woman, a Nepali woman, and you have a child, and the father is not a citizen of Nepal, or you cannot prove that he is a citizen of Nepal, which is a problem with, children who are born outside of wedlock, or just especially in Province 2, where you have a lot of border regions and there's a lot of fear of Indian influence. It means it can be pretty hard for you to get your child Indian citizenship. To my knowledge, there is no sub-national level of identification in Nepal. So you are required to have citizenship to do pretty much everything and to get every other form of identification or to do anything in the formal economy. So this includes opening a bank account to fulfill Know Your Customer regulations. So if you can't get a bank account, it obviously limits your ability to access remittances, or it exposes you to the risks that are inherent in the informal financial system. So there were reports from the Forum of Women, Law and Development in Nepal, which is actually an organization that we met with, that said that many women they do use these informal channels, but most had reported at some point or another, if not being robbed or some other form, had experienced some level of risk in the system, whether that was not being able to access deposits fully on time or being exposed to the whims of people in their family or friends, which obviously is not the best over time. So this is a big problem in making the citizenship laws easier to implement on the ground, making them easier in practice, as Stephanie mentioned in our last panel, is incredibly important when furthering the financial inclusion in Nepal. There's no way so Nepal has a technicality where you can actually open a bank account and not fulfill the full Know Your Customer regulations. However, the level that this is set to is about a yearly income of $800 a year, which is low even by Nepali standards. So there's a very, very high bar. I mean, it's very easy to be excluded from that. So there's a lot of people who are excluded from being able to access formal financial institutions, but don't really apply into this area where you might be able to qualify for the exclusion. The other problems, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, is that there are some areas in Nepal where you have, and this is not an issue that is unique to Nepal in and of itself, but happens all over the world, where you have, whether it's cultural problems with women accessing citizenship, or even family issues of families not wanting women to have citizenship. There was a report also by the Forum for Women in Law and Development in Nepal that mentioned that many women said that their male relatives did not want them to gain citizenship because the male relatives felt that they wanted property claims. Whether or not they actually did was irrelevant, but that prevented them from gaining their own citizenship and affecting this. So again, this is a problem of on the ground, the reality on the ground versus what's written in the text. And so this brings us to the question of what are the answers, right? So it's hard to say. You can propose something of a subnational level. As some of you might know, in California, where I'm from, you don't need citizenship to gain a state identification, right? You can get a driver's license without being a citizen in the United States in California. There's also non-driver's license forms of identification. But the question is, do populations risk, if it's easier for somebody to go get this type of identification so they can open up a bank account or something, do they risk giving up their right to citizenship? So let's say you are somebody who can't prove your father's citizenship. If you go and get some form of identification so you can open up a bank account, do you risk giving up, or do you risk having that used against you in some other capacity in the future? And the same could be true for the refugees who Catherine was mentioning in an earlier panel. If they go and get some other form of citizenship, or not citizenship, identification so they can participate in the formal financial sector, do they risk giving up rights that they might have under Nepalese law? As was mentioned, Nepal is not a signatory to most UNHCR conventions. But those are risks as well. And without that, those people are just excluded. And to just round this all out with another anecdote, for those of us who wanted to go get SIM cards in Nepal, we had to bring our passports with us, right? There wasn't like here in the United States where you can just go to Best Buy and just or 7-Eleven, buy a SIM card and register it online really quickly, and you're good to go. You have to bring your passport with you. You have to prove that you have a visa to be in the country for a certain amount of time. And if you're a citizen of Nepal, you have to have your citizenship documents with you to get basic services. And the last thing I'll make sure is that there are moves towards mobile money in Nepal, which obviously would open up more areas. But at the moment, it is not very well used, even though there is significant mobile penetration. I believe the mobile penetration in Nepal is at something like 130%. So it's very high, but there is no sort of M-Pesa equivalent yet. The United Nations Capital and Development Program was working with one of the mobile providers on creating a program like that. But during our time there, they said that the private company had decided to go its own route, and to my knowledge, that had not been released, or if it was released, it was not in significant use yet. So that's all I got for now.
Thanks, Spencer. Now we'll get back to a few questions that I have for each of you. I want to apologize to Chloe for being a little bit out of line earlier. And just as a reminder, Chloe is presented on fiscal federalism, or the decentralization of of the fiscal system in Nepal. So the follow-up question to the
Sorry, since I already got to answer a question, I don't know if you want to direct it
Sure.
towards one of them.
Let's
since I
do
already
that
had
then.
That opportunity.
Yeah, that's a good idea since we have limited time. I'll direct that to someone else then. Let me then ask Lynn a question. And as a reminder, Lynn spoke on government accountability, specifically the new foreign aid management policy in Nepal. And the question that I'd like to ask you is, would it be more effective if Nepal's provincial and local governments can also mobilize foreign aid?
So my answer to this question is, right now, I don't think the federal government should give provincial and local governments too much autonomy over using and obtaining grants and loans, because Nepal is still undergoing a transition to a federal democratic system, and this is based on the Constitution in 2015, which was not a long time ago, and this process includes like amendment of existing acts, restructuring the civil services at all levels, as well as like the development of fiscal governance. So I think it's a really long process, and I don't think local governments have a capacity to utilize and implement those projects effectively at this time. And another concern is there is also a problem of corruption. So as I know, one of the biggest donors to Nepal, the UK government, has voiced its concern over the corruption in Nepal's government. So I think right now it should be focusing on transparency, accountability, and capacity building. And but I do think there should be a process to shorten the process of registration or approval that will make it easier for local governments to get more funding. Thank you.
Thank you. And does the new foreign aid policy raise the effectiveness of foreign aid in Nepal? What else should be done to realize this goal?
I think, thank you for the question. I think it did increase the effectiveness. Like according to the BTI 2016, which is an index to measure the effectiveness of the transformation to democracy, it received a score of 6, which is like higher than like Thailand and some like other developing countries. So I think it has been successful in using like foreign aid like more effectively. But I do think there should be like more policies to facilitate this process. Like it could be it could redesign its website of online aid management platform. Like it could provide more assessment, like whether those projects are effectively implemented, or like what are the geographic allocation, like where what provinces need those funding most. I think it should be more effective.
Thank you. Next question is for Spencer, and as a refresher, he spoke about financial inclusion and citizenship in Nepal. So my question is, can Nepal increase financial inclusion without increasing the risk of money laundering?
Yeah, so for one thing to note before I answer the question that I sort of glossed over when I was giving my short presentation is that about 25% of people, or NGOs and the U.S. government backs up the methodology done to find this figure, is that about 25% of people who are eligible under law to have Nepalese citizenship do not currently hold a certificate of Nepalese citizenship. The Nepali government disputes this in our talks. They would say the number is much lower. This is an inflated figure that, you know, they dispute the methodology. But other Western governments seem to look at the methodology and seem this is an appropriate figure. So this is something about 4 million or so people in Nepal who could, by the law, have access to citizenship who don't have it. The reason why I say yes is that they could is I think that there are ways of increasing identification and opening up bank accounts at a lower level without increasing money laundering. And the other side is that we were told by multiple people, and outside research backs this up, that there's already so much money laundering going on in Nepal that you can, the base is, it's already so rampant that I think you can do a lot for financial inclusion without risking that. That being said, keeping open the avenues of bringing formal money into the economy is very important, as it makes up such a high level. Whether or not that's good for the country or not is a different story. But it is necessary, and recently, relatively recently, within the last couple of years, the Financial Action Task Force removed Nepal from its like blacklist of countries where money laundering was like extremely rampant to just like its gray list where it's just sort of rampant, which has a lot of meanings in terms of the current attitudes of world banks to de-risk and their correspondent banking relationships away from working with banks. So what that means is just when you have a correspondent banking relationship, one bank actually will send money to another bank. And a lot of Western banks see this as a risk. They don't want to be involved in any money laundering things because they don't want to be, they would like to minimize their risk of fines and things like that. So when you have banks say, oh, we're not going to send money back to your country, it creates huge problems, especially with remittances. So I think there is substantial room there to grow, but obviously there are always trade-offs.
Thank you. With the last 10 minutes we have before we break for lunch, I'd like to open up questions to anyone in the audience. Yes, Sam.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. Okay, cool. Oh, there we go. So I guess my question is for Lynn. I think something that was interesting. I really like that you pointed out that there was this database that people can go to, because we heard a lot about how the Chinese are getting secret, NGOs are getting secret approvals and things like that we're not aware of. But I was wondering if you could talk about the actual projects that are going on, and whether the development projects that are being funded by the Chinese, as a lot of infrastructure projects, are actually being done in a way that is helping the Nepali economy. Just because we've heard, China's MO is they send their own teams, they send their own workers, and it's not just in Nepal; it's throughout the world. So, how is that? Do you think that impacts the Nepali economy? Do you think that's an acceptable trade-off for the development?
Yes. Actually, I think this question would be better answered if you ask Nepalese citizens. So based on my research, Chinese investment and overseas projects in Nepal are mainly focusing on their energy, road transportation, education, and health. But I should say, I think I haven't seen the results of their transportation, construction, and energy building. I think they are still going on. And for health and education, when I was in Nepal, I saw some projects like China is rebuilding their high school and temples after the earthquake. So I think that's contributes to the the reconstruction after the earthquake. And one thing I found is interesting is I heard John said when he talked with Nepali people, and they really appreciate China's projects. I don't know if they really say the good outcomes from that, but I think basically it's helping with their basic welfare. But yeah, I think in terms of the real outcome, I need to do more research on it. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Thank you.
So I've got a question that'll fall somewhere between Spencer and Chloe. Given that we have heard talks about a need to reform social or enforce laws to do with culture aspects. We need to focus on these things in the economy to keep growth happening, and now we're hearing about financial inclusion. I'm really curious, in a big picture sense, how should we prioritize? Where is financial inclusion in this? Is this something that the international government should put as priority number one? Is this something that should be fit into one of those other categories? Do you guys have any sense of the prioritization or importance relative to these other events of financial inclusion?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I think it's important. I think it's important because the remittances give you a base of financial knowledge, right? Of a platform, an introduction to a platform which you can teach people. The fact that 52% of all formal bank accounts in Nepal are only used to receive remittances, right, and they're not used in their full capacity, shows there's a tremendous growth potential where you do not have to teach people what a bank account is or how to use it or things like that, and there's a potential huge market for these sort of under $20 savings accounts and things like that at the micro level, where you can really help people expand their financial portfolios. I know sometimes it sounds weird to talk about financial portfolios for people who are at the base of the financial pyramid, but most people do informally save money, lend money, borrow money, all of these things, even the very poor. And that's a huge area of expansion. I think it's not a case of, it's not a zero-sum game here, because this is something that can and should be spurred by the private sector, because private sector banks have their own, that there's profit to be made here. And so you can encourage that without throwing away other development goals. But also, you have to recognize the type of transformation these things bring is not always going to be transformative. So like remittances, a lot of times this will not, financial inclusion is not necessarily going to bring transformative growth. It's going to allow people to start more sort of subsistence businesses, open more sort of kiosks and shops and things like that. It's not necessarily going to be a driver of economic growth. So these are good things because it helps people manage the risk in their lives, right? It takes them out of informality where, somebody who's a friend or a relative, might not have the money, or somebody might, come into your house one day and steal the money out from under your mattress, right? Those are all things that come with informality, but that's not to say that it will lead to economic growth. So it should be a priority. Should it be the biggest priority? No, but I also don't think you have to sacrifice other things to achieve that level of financial inclusion.
And okay, I'll just very briefly. So I think in terms of development that comes from decentralization, clearly development's very important, but I think that when it comes from decentralization, it has to be a bit more of a gradual process. And I think that there's been a lot of international pressure on Nepal to make these federalism changes very quickly, when in fact, countries that have tried to introduce fiscal decentralization too quickly have not gotten things into place. And like I mentioned before, it kind of re-centralizes. And I mean, in terms of collecting revenue, you really have to get local citizens on board. They may not have been taxed before, and they really have to trust the system and trust that they're actually going to see the revenue come back, because this is a system that's pretty unfamiliar at that local level. And I think in terms of capacity building, there needs to be kind of sequencing of reforms to make sure that these local government officials kind of like understand the tasks at hand and are able to actually implement them before they're moving on to bigger things. So I think that although it is a priority in terms of all of the other things that have to come along with the 2015 Constitution, fiscal decentralization and kind of that type of development is something that can and probably should come a little bit more slowly, and therefore could potentially be a lower priority, I guess.
So I have a question for Spencer on remittances.
Yep.
Two quick examples. When I was getting dog permits for the Bahamas, they would prefer a post office money order as opposed to the bank. And similarly, when we were sending money home to India for birthdays and things, post office money orders were prioritized. It was an easier form of exchange. Have you actually looked at remittances through the post office versus the bank?
So I have not looked at the various ways remittances are sent back. I will tell you that when, anecdotally, I know that before, when it was harder for banks in Nepal to do business with international banks, most money went through informal channels. And again, unfortunately, I'm blanking on the name. There was a name for these in Nepal. But most was sent back through informal channels. I do not know if there's a post office equivalent in terms of money orders or Western Union or something to that effect. So it's something that I would need to do more research on.
Well, it looks like we're out of time. If you have additional questions for the panelists, you're free to ask them during lunch, which will be for the next 30 minutes before panel 4 starts at 12:30. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the last panel of the day. This panel, we're going to be discussing women's rights in Nepal. So we have 3 wonderful women up here to be discussing this topic. I'm just going to go down the line and give you guys some quick bios for everybody real quick. Our first speaker will be Karen. And Karen was born in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and was raised in Japan. She's a second-year grad student here at SAIS. She concentrates in international economics, international law, and Latin American studies. And she's also working toward a specialization in economic development. She received her Bachelor of Arts degrees, summa cum laude, in academic distinction in political science, international studies, and foreign language from Southeast Missouri State University. Her most recent professional experiences include the World Bank in Brazil, where she assisted in the development of policy notes for the government and conducted constitutional research on the Brazilian pension system, and the Center for Constitutional Studies and Democratic Development in Italy, where she worked as a research assistant analyzing the impact of comparative law on the judgments of the UK Supreme Court. Before SAIS, Karen was an entrepreneur and managed her own business in Japan. Her areas of interest include constitutional and economic development. Next on the line, we have Singha Lee. And she is a second-year SAIS MA candidate concentrating in international economics and international law and organizations. Before SAIS, she graduated from UCLA cum laude in 2017 with a BA in China Studies. From 2015 to 2016, she studied at both Peking University and Beijing Normal University, learning about China in depth. After earning her bachelor's degree, she completed the Hopkins Nanjing certificate program, focusing her studies on China-US relations. Her current area of focus at SAIS is studying the impact of trade in both developed and developing countries. And our last but not least panelist for this panel is going to be Sarah Ann Ye. And she is a second-year MA candidate concentrating in international law and international economics. And Sarah Ann graduated summa cum laude from the University of Maryland with a BS in biological sciences and a minor in international development and conflict management. She then spent time in Indonesia as a Fulbright English teaching assistant and has interned at the U.S. embassies in Malawi, excuse me, and La Paz, Bolivia. Sarah Ann is interested in promoting international science and technology collaboration and will be joining the U.S. Foreign Service in 2019 as a Rangel Fellow. Outside of her professional life, Sarah Ann sits on the board of directors for the Fund of Education Abroad, a nonprofit organization that provides scholarships for minority and first-generation students to study abroad. So we're really excited to hear from these 3 very accomplished, wonderful women. So we'll be starting with Karen. And Karen will be discussing citizenship in Nepal, cascading effects on gender inequality, statelessness, and economic development.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. So as Anna said, I'll be talking about the issue of citizenship in Nepal and how that discriminates against women and creates a cascading effect in the country. So Nepal has made progress towards gender equality. So for instance, from October 2015 to June 2016, Nepal elected its first female leaders into powerful positions. So for example, the president, the speaker of the Parliament, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It has also enacted laws that protects women's rights, such as the right to safer maternity and reproduction and the right against exploitation. 33% of the parliament seats at the federal and provincial level is also reserved for women. And there are several programs to decrease gender inequality in the country. However, despite all this progress, women still discriminated through the Citizenship Act in the Constitution of Nepal 2015. So through the Constitution Act of 2006, Nepali women still cannot confer citizenship to their children. So in other words, women can provide, if a Nepali woman is married to a Nepali man, her children can be Nepali citizens. But if she's married to a foreign national or she cannot prove the relationship of her child with a Nepali man, then her child cannot have the Nepali citizenship. And that creates a lot of problems in the country, not only in terms of gender discrimination, but in terms of violating several international conventions, putting at risk the legitimacy of its own constitution, and also putting children at risk of statelessness. So, for instance, by violating a lot of international conventions on the protection of women's and children's rights, Nepal is violating its own constitution because in its own constitution, Article 15(1)(b)(3), it says that Nepal should implement any agreement or conventions that it abides to. And by being part of many conventions on women's and children's rights and not and violating children's and women's rights through the Citizenship Act, Nepal is also violating its own constitution. Now, the denial of the provision of citizenship not only discriminates against women, as I said, it also puts their children at risk of statelessness. And by putting their children at the risk of statelessness, they are kind of predetermine the future of those children. So stateless people are often poor, and they are seen as less deserving of protection and support. They cannot participate in politics. They have less access to basic service, such as education and the healthcare system. And by having less access to those services that are very important for human capital, they are more prone to ended up working in the informal sector with low-paid jobs and where they are more willing to accept more risky conditions. And putting all those factors together, that hinders inclusive economic development in the country. Because human capital is important, gender equality is important. Nepal is putting its long-term goal of economic growth at risk. So changing the Citizenship Act of 2006 in the Constitution of 2015, it's a short-term solution that can bring so many positive effects in the long term for inclusive economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was great. So next we're going to hear from Singha Lee, and she is going to be addressing the slow struggle, the obstacles to equal access for women's education in Nepal.
Thank you. So throughout this study trip to Nepal and my research afterwards, I focus on gender inequalities, especially focusing on women's unequal access to education. The thesis of my paper is that even the government in Nepal were to implement the constitution and other general laws in a very efficient way, there would still remain social and cultural factors that would hinder women from getting equal access to education. Since social and cultural factors were what our Nepal trip did not touch upon, I find my research a nice extension of this study trip. So before I left for this trip, I already clearly had in mind that the topic of my interest revolves around the women's issues, but I could narrow down my topic within women's issue after we visited the UNDP. At UNDP, their staff talked about still existing tradition called chapati, a tradition that that requires women to leave their house for the duration of their period, and force them to stay in the menstrual huts or alongside the kettle. And throughout my research, I have found out that this tradition is one of the main influences that hinder women from having equal access to education, as this tradition restrains women from many activities such as going to school. And this tradition was in fact already banned twice in Nepal, first in 2008 and again in 2017. But many families, including women themselves, still follow this tradition as they believe that this tradition is still necessary and vital to their religious belief. And another finding that I discuss in my paper is that Nepali women tend to marry and give birth at a very young age compared to women in other countries. According to the data from UNESCO, 40% of Nepali girls are already married by the time they're 15, and the average age of marriage is 17.5 years old. And I find this social tradition very detrimental to women's pursuit of furthering their education, as married Nepali women feel pressure to leave their school, and the pregnancy makes them difficult to continue their education. And many studies, including the one I just mentioned from UNESCO, highlight the correlation between early pregnancy and child marriage with higher illiteracy rates. And in fact, just like the chapati tradition, the practice of child marriage was already banned at the 2014 Girls Summit, and Nepal signed a charter that commits the country to cease the practice children's marriage by 2020. However, this practice is still an ongoing practice, and therefore I came up with the conclusion that even just simply by changing the law actually doesn't change the social culture context in which such traditions are deeply rooted. In this way, the government's efforts in eliminating such a tradition will be continue to be slow and challenging process. And other than these two phenomena, the reality of the perception toward a woman pursuing their education is that investing in a woman's education is worthless on both personal and the familial level, and only minimally beneficial to the public. So even though such patriarchal ideas are less widespread in modern times, the idea that women belong to a husband's family or to somebody else is still a commonly held view. And the notion that women are of lower status in the husband's family implies that they will not get time or support to pursue their education. So before I end, I would like to acknowledge that Nepal has actually kept making attempts to fix gender inequality, and I believe that their efforts should be lauded. Throughout my research, I have found out that a lot of multilateral organizations, including the World Bank, has paid attention and provided aid. However, there is still undoubtedly further efforts to be done to fix this problem, especially in the area of education. And especially because the support for education has declined drastically after the 2015 earthquake and following the flood in 2017. And I understand that during the crisis, the time when the importance of education is most easily neglected. However, I would like to say that education is one of the fundamental rights to which women have to be granted access under any circumstances. Therefore, I'd like to support the governments to increase their commitment to create policies and laws that can eventually persist and succeed within the framework of existing strong cultural ties. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting. And we're going to hear from our last panelist now, Sarah-Ann Ye. And Sarah-Ann is going to discuss the paradox of women's political power in Nepal.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us all morning and this early afternoon. And thanks, Anna, and my co-panelists. So I decided to do my research paper on women's political participation and influence in Nepal. And I think the issues that were raised by Karen and Sanghua have two implications for political participation. First, limitations to access to education or citizenship or other socioeconomic rights are barriers for women who want to participate in the political sphere. But at the same time, more women are needed in the political sphere to then tackle these issues. So there's a cycle here that Nepal and many other countries recognize and are trying to break. And when I was in Nepal with the team, I was struck by the top-line numbers of women's political participation. As of the 2017 elections, women occupy 40% of all political positions in the country. That's at the local, the provincial, and the national levels. Nepal is only one of 11 countries that have a female head of state. And there's a high proportion of women from lower class or who are indigenous in Nepali politics compared to other countries in the region around the world. So when we look at this 40% number, I was like, wow, that's awesome. By comparison, in the United States, only 32% of the seats in the House of Representatives are held by women, and 37%, only 20% in the House of Representatives and 23% in the Senate in the US are held by women. So Nepal is outpacing the US by 10 to 15% in terms of female representation. And I think that that is a point that really should be underscored, that Nepal has taken a very conscious effort to increase women's political participation in a way that this country hasn't. And so I wanted to look at why and how Nepal arrived at this relatively large number of women in politics, but also look at more of the complexity that underlies this phenomenon. So after Nepal emerged from a decade-long civil war, which some of my colleagues have highlighted earlier today, the interim parliament decided that they wanted to pass regulations or laws that ensured that more women were in government, whether that be in elected seats or in the bureaucracy. So the first stage of the reforms mandated that 1/3 of all seats in the government be held by women. That was then reinforced by the 2008 Constituent Assembly that said that 33% of their membership had to be women. These quotas were met in both the first and the second Constituent Assembly and highlighted women's issues such as citizenship and education in the laws and in the constitutional framework discussions that these assemblies held. After the 2015 Constitution was passed, 2 years later in the 2017 local election law, the government required political parties to field 40% of female candidates in the 2017 elections. And most importantly, one woman was required to be fielded for either the mayor or the deputy mayor position at the local level, or the ward chair or the deputy ward chair position at the provincial level. So that ensured that women were being considered for relatively high positions at all levels of government. And it worked. In 2017, 40% of the seats that were up for election were won by women, and these women entered office subsequently. However, there are still a lot of issues to be dealt with quotas. As highlighted by my co-panelists, there's a lot of underlying socioeconomic barriers for women who enter these positions. The Asia Foundation did a survey of the newly elected female leaders in 2017, and they found that a lot of them were facing gender or caste-based discrimination in their places of work. So their male colleagues might say, oh, well, you're just a quota leader, you're here to fill numbers, I'm not really going to listen to you. Or women, because of lack of access to education or other financial literacy tools, were unable to perform their jobs in an effective way. So for example, 53% of elected women surveyed by the Asia Foundation said they faced workplace challenges such as time management, financial difficulties, or other forms of discrimination, and 48% of these respondents said they had no idea how to address these problems. So this highlights the fact that just getting women into office doesn't necessarily lead to gender equality or parity, and more needs to be done to train these elected female leaders once they have a seat at the table. And that's really going to be a next step for Nepal and many other countries who are facing similar issues. Another thing to highlight is that even though we have 40% female participation in elected positions, women are still not able to hold the highest levels of leadership. So for example, women only fill 2% of the mayor or chair positions in Nepal, and they fill 91% of the deputy positions. So they are still having to face the men who fill the highest levels of leadership at local, provincial, and the national level. And furthermore, women only won 2% of the non-quota ward member seats and 1% of the non-quota ward chair seats, which show that even though we're introducing more women into politics, they're really only being elected because it's legally mandated by the 2015 and the 2017 Local Election Act. So I would like to just conclude by saying, like, why does this matter? Why do we need more women in politics, and why do we need more training for women who are already in politics? Well, first, as highlighted earlier, the 2000 Nepali Constitution has several provisions that protect women's rights, specifically in Article 8, and these include the right to family, the right to health, the right to citizenship, and without more women in politics, how can Nepal hope to implement these very gendered considerations in a way that will be effective for women around the country? And also, as highlighted by earlier panels, Nepal has a very large proportion of their population that goes abroad to work and send remittances home. And this population that goes abroad is predominantly men or youth. So that leaves a lot of women back home in Nepal in rural communities to take on both traditionally female and male roles. And there's anecdotal evidence that this has caused women to step up more in their communities, to take on more responsibility, yet they're not having the training or the education that would prepare them to be effective in these new positions in their society. So I think that these changes and this progress and these reforms are very promising. Nepal has really emphasized they want top-down reform related to gender equality and gender parity, but more has to be done from the bottom-up level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah Ann, and thank you to all three of you guys. That's a really wonderful way to close out our afternoon. I have a question that I'd like each of you to touch on. I guess we can start with Karen and move our way back down. So we often talk about gender equality as a cross-cutting issue, one that affects many sectors like politics, economics, society, and more. And how do the conclusions of your research impact these other sectors, and what are the broad-reaching implications of your conclusions?
So I guess for my paper, as I said before, not providing women the opportunity to grant citizenship to their children is kind of hindering Nepal from inclusive economic development. Their children, if not coming from, let's say, from a Nepali man, they become stateless unless they can have the citizenship from a foreign national. And by not allowing those children to have access to citizenship, you are kind of preventing them to have access to good basic services such as education and healthcare. And by affecting that sector, you are also affecting the opportunity of those children to have better jobs when they grow up. And but by doing that, you are increasing the informality of the country, and that affects productivity, affects development. So I think gender inequality is an issue that not only affects, it's not only a point that is affecting, is not only discriminating against women, but is affecting so many other sectors in the country.
Singha or Sarah Ann, do you guys want to touch on that in relation to your topics at all, or no?
I think, as highlighted earlier, women's political participation will lead to more policies that are gender inclusive, and having more women who have voices at the table and who have the influence to push forward these agendas and policies can impact a lot of sectors like education, like citizenship, like socioeconomic statuses, and without equality or inclusion at the highest levels, we can't hope to see reform trickle down.
Right. Well, thank you guys for those answers. Does anyone in the audience have any questions for our panelists today? Get right here. Fernanda's got the mic, if you'll wait on her.
Thank you all. Is it working? Yeah. Thank you all for your talks. That was great. So I know in many South Asian countries and elsewhere in the world, there's a lot of women are very good at kind of organizing themselves in order to get access to finance or certain services that they don't have access to. And in your research on various topics, if any of you would like to address whether you saw this type of organization in Nepal, whether for education or politics, and kind of what opportunities that might allow in terms of like grassroots development for these causes. Thanks.
Why don't we go ahead and have Spencer ask his question to give you guys a moment to think about your answers to Chloe's question, and then we can move on. Spencer?
Yeah, so I have a question for Sarah Ann specifically. So I was wondering your thoughts on whether or not the quotas might actually hurt
the elections of women to some of these higher roles. So, for example, like if the quota is for a woman to be in the deputy mayor position, might that affect like voters' preference? Like they go into the voting booth and go, well, if a woman's going to like be deputy mayor by default, I'm not going to vote for the female candidate for the top position, and maybe that might actually have a weirdly detrimental negative effect. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can address Spencer's question specifically, and then we can talk about Chloe's. I think it might be a little too early to say, given that these quotas have only been in place really for the 2017 national election. So perhaps we could see some long-term detrimental effects in terms of seeing women in these deputy positions, but still seeing men in the principal positions. However, I do think that quotas are really important for getting women to have a seat at the table. And I think we can debate all day, and people have debated for years about whether or not quotas are effective. But I think that they are a good starting place because as the Asia Foundation's survey shows, that without the quotas, women are much less likely to win a general election. And even though women assumed office in 40% of these political positions, they didn't necessarily win 40% of the popular vote because of the constitutional mandates and the legal codes that regulated elections. Women filled positions that otherwise would have gone to men. So I think when we're talking about equality, about participation, like this is the first step. And eventually it would be great if women won 40% of the popular vote, but that's going to be a much slower process to getting there. And then for Chloe's point, I think that the women in the constitutional assemblies that formed the 2015 Constitution were really good at rallying behind each other and pushing women's issues to the forefront. And that's something that led to Article 38 of the Constitution that specifically secured women's rights and also ensured that quotas were maintained past the constitutional assemblies for like the general elections. So I think that that is an example of women rallying behind each other.
Singha or Karen, do you want to address? No, all right. So I have another question for y'all. So I know, Singha, you mentioned that you knew going into the trip that you wanted to write your paper on women's rights. I was wondering, Karen and Sarah Ann, did you just kind of have an idea going into the trip that you also wanted to write about this topic? Or was that something that you decided after the trip? And then what did you know about the status of women in Nepal before going into the trip? Or what did you kind of have an idea that we would find out about that? And was there anything either on the trip or while doing your research after the trip that surprised you or challenged kind of your preconceived notion of what we would find out?
I think for me, I decided to write my paper on citizenship because I thought Nepal is one of the only few countries still in the world that discriminates against women passing on citizenship to their children. As Ana said, I come from Brazil, and that's something that is not common in my country. So I was very interested in the topic and kind of learning more about how the Constitution and this act in particular can affect inclusive economic development in the future. So that was my main reason behind choosing this topic.
Yeah. And originally going into the trip, I thought I was going to write about different ethnic groups in Nepal and how they contributed to the political process. But once we got there and we started talking with different stakeholders, I thought highlighting gender disparities would be a little bit more interesting. And there's more literature on it, so it's easier to kind of pull from different sources and be able to put together a cohesive narrative. But I also think that ethnic representation and diversity is folded into the gender issue. For example, 46% of female elected officials are from the Dalit caste, so that's the lowest caste in Hindu society, and 23% of the women identify as indigenous. So beyond like the gender inclusivity, these types of regulations and these types of quotas also ensure that women from different groups of society are able to hold positions.
Wonderful. Singha, do you have anything you want to?
So
So before I went to the study trip, I knew that the inequality in Nepal is a very serious problem. But then after I started researching, it was like beyond my expectation. And as I mentioned, like the tradition called like chapati, and I found other traditions that's still like ongoing. And I've just find that this is just beyond my expectation. Yeah, I was just very surprised.
Do we have any more audience questions? Nobody? All right, so one more for you guys. So it is really interesting hearing about kind of the mandates that Nepal has put into place in terms of women's political quotas, and you talked specifically about, in that terms, that they're farther than the U.S. Are there any other like specific things that stood out to you guys in terms of comparing? All of you are from different places, kind of women's positions in your home countries and the status of women in Nepal, other than kind of we've talked about that it was kind of worse than you expected. Was there anything else maybe on the positive side that stood out to you guys in terms of women in Nepal?
I mean, I think the fact that their president is a woman is awesome. And we had the chance to meet with her while we were in Kathmandu, which was fantastic. And I think, here in the US, we talk a lot about women in political leadership and looking at the 2020 presidential bids. Like, it's really exciting to see more women running, but the US, has still yet to elect a woman to the highest office in our land, and Nepal has. So I think that's very inspirational.
I think in Brazil, we did have our first female president elected, Dilma, which ended up in an impeachment. But besides that, we do still have a lot of gender discrimination and gender-based violence, which is something that is common in Nepal as well. But something that Saraham addressed, despite of the impact, in my country, in Brazil, we don't have as many elected women into government positions yet. So that was something very interesting for me.
So just like Brazil, like Korea also had female president.
And the U.S. is behind.
Yeah. So that was a positive side. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well. All right, look, we've got another audience question. Great, Sam.
Yeah, so I guess this is to Sarah Ann. I think I would push back a bit, and I would want your comment on this. So, yes, it was fantastic that Nepal has a female president. Yes, it was awesome that we got to meet her. She's the head of state. She's not the head of government. That's the prime minister, and that's a man. It's been a man. We also see that throughout. That there were lots of instances that we were told about where the women didn't necessarily know that they were being put up for election. They were just their names were there because their husbands or their communities had put them there to fill the quotas. So I guess obviously it's good to have more women at the table, but what are the effects of this kind of tokenization almost, and what are the lessons that we can apply to it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I don't think at all we can say that Nepal or really any country in the world has reached true gender parity in politics, and there's still a lot of challenges in the whole world. When I was looking at the literature, though, I know that when we were in Nepal, people were saying, oh, well, like women didn't even know that they were running and all that stuff, but I couldn't find quantitative evidence that supported it. The survey from the Asia Foundation that I referenced a little bit earlier found that 44% of the female candidates were encouraged to run by a political party, 13% were encouraged by family members, 8% were encouraged by their husbands, and 10% chose to run from their own volition. So yes, the 8% encouraged by their husbands is a substantial proportion of the women that were in this survey, and that's something that can be addressed in the future. But I also think that it's equally important to recognize that 10% of the women ran because they wanted to, and they chose to do that. And the survey also showed that 88% of the women who ran and were elected were already involved in some sort of community engagement project, whether that be they worked worked in business or in social work or in agriculture or in some other type of community involvement. It shows that women are already in positions that can lead to future leadership. We just have to get them there, and then we have to train them so they're effective once they are there.
Anyone else have anything? So we've got David in the back. Yep.
Thanks. This is somewhat tangentially related. This is somewhat tangentially related to good governance, but just especially, Karen, given your entrepreneurship experience, what do you think are the opportunities for women entrepreneurship, and how can they be encouraged to be members of society, not only in a political sense, but also in a sense of equality in the economic sphere as well?
My research didn't focus on that in Nepal, but I can say, judging by the cultural aspects and the opportunities of education for women, as we mentioned, that the opportunities are low. I came across some research on the opportunity for microfinancing for women, but I wouldn't be able to comment deeply on that subject as it was not part of my research question. Yeah.
All right. So does anyone have anything to add? Oh, all right. Well, thank you all for speaking on that today. It's a really wonderful way to close out the afternoon.
Thank you.
Just a couple of quick thank yous and an announcement. Of course, thank you to all the panelists. It was really wonderful. Thank you to the audience for your attention. Thanks to the Star Foundation for sponsoring our research. And all the registered attendees will circulate the papers, and this is being recorded so we can circulate the video as well. So thank you. Oh, and thanks to myself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.